Their spirits were refreshed when they heard Imperial Monarch Tai Jing, and they didn't hesitate to continue forward. Bang! Stars burned while emanating pale green divine flames that seemed to form an ocean, and they even carried strands of tribulation energy, causing it to seem extremely dangerous. When faced with such a situation, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing didn't hold back any longer. He suddenly withdrew another natural spirit treasure that was suffused with an ancient and desolate aura. It was shaped like a jar, had a rough exterior, was inscribed with the mysterious diagrams of plants, animals, and people of ancient times offering sacrifices to the gods and ancestors. At this moment, as soon as the jar appeared, it droned before emanating a ray of light, and it was like a boundlessly vast silver river that poured down from the sky. Swish! The images of numerous fiend gods appeared from within the silver river. They were extremely divine, mighty, and haughty, and they actually resided in the surroundings and completely dispersed the attacks that came from all directions. In an instant, all the others in the group felt the pressure upon them lessen abruptly, and they felt a wave of relief. The jar of ancient barbarians. The universe-enlightened ancestral gods exclaimed with surprise as they'd recognized this natural spirit treasure that was passed down in the Xiaohao clan. This treasure was like a treasure born to be a barbarian god farm, and it was capable of completely refining one's enemies into barbarian gods that would be under one's control. It was extremely miraculous and unfathomable. Imperial Monarch Tai Jing couldn't help but feel a wave of self-satisfaction when he noticed this. The jar of ancient barbarians was one of his trump cards, and he tempered it for almost 19,000 years, while the amount of barbarian gods sealed within it amounted to over 1,000. Most of these barbarian gods were refined from the prisoners that the Xiaohao clan had captured. The weakest amongst them was at the domain enlightened spirit god realm, and barbarian gods like these occupied more than half of the total. The amount of barbarian gods that possessed the strength of universe-enlightened ancestral gods occupied almost 20% of the total, whereas the remaining 10% was occupied by ferocious beasts, divine flying beasts, and so on and so forth that possessed unique abilities. At this moment, all the barbarian gods he'd utilized possessed a strength comparable to universe-enlightened ancestral gods. Moreover, they were dead beings that had been refined into barbaric gods, so they could be said to be impermeable to the elements and unafraid of tribulation energy. So, they just happened to be able to display unexpected effects here. Rumble. This expanse of the starry sky was fluctuating like waves while the pale green divine flames shook, and the burning stars circulated while emanating a force that was capable of obliterating the world. But at this moment, all of this destructive force was unable to harm Imperial Monarch Tai Jing's group at all. In next to no time, their group had passed through this dangerous area, and the scene in the surroundings became deathly silent and ghastly once more. The burning stars had become motionless, the pale green divine flames had stopped surging, and even the tribulation energy in the air had silently vanished without a trace. Only deathly silence remained, and it was extremely silent and mysterious. Imperial Monarch Tai Jing suddenly stopped moving when he noticed this, and his eyes flickered with a cold glow. Where are we? We seem to have lost our way. How could this have happened? Could we have fallen into a type of restriction? All the universe-enlightened ancestral gods were shocked, and they stopped moving right after Imperial Monarch Tai Jing had before becoming vigilant to the extreme. Watch out! Imperial Monarch Tai Jing seemed to have noticed something, and his expression suddenly changed. He shouted out loudly in a deep voice while he suddenly activated the jar of ancient barbarians in his hand. Roar! At practically the exact same moment, and along with a dragon roar that surged through the surroundings, an extremely enormous dragon head shot out from the starry sky in the distance. Its horn was like a mountain, its whiskers were like waterfalls that descended from the heavens, and its eyes that seemed like a pair of brilliant suns had swiftly locked onto them. In an instant, a wave of icy coldness swept through the figures of everyone, including Imperial Monarch Tai Jing, and their expressions changed rapidly. An aura of extreme danger covered the heavens and the earth as it descended towards them. 7 days later, strands of light violet divine light suffused Xianxia's body. It flowed densely, was illusory, and enveloped his entire body while emanating an ancient and tranquil aura. On the other hand, the blood within his body seethed like lava and rumbled as it swept through him. It was like a myriad of tempestuous waves were howling furiously and ceaselessly tempering his physique. Bang! 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 At this moment, in the area above this deathly silent starry sky that was covered by the skeletons of dragons, a wave of endless rumbling that sounded like two divine mountains colliding with each other resounded and surged through the surroundings. This sound came from the vital energy within Xianxia's body, and it seemed to be extremely grand yet didn't carry any offensive ability. Otherwise, the entire tomb of dragons would have been alarmed by it and an unknown calamity would have definitely descended. This kid is really extraordinary. The blood-tempering spirit control technique is a holy shaman's secret technique that came from the last era, and it's completely different from the techniques of the current era. I never expected that he would be able to pass through the threshold so easily. At this moment, Senior White, who'd been constantly paying close attention to Chen, she couldn't help but arouse a wisp of admiration in his eyes. He was very clearly aware that Xianxia's body had been tempered successively by the Universe Stars Layer body-forging technique, the Rock Divine technique, and the energy of numerous grand Daos. It had long since moved towards a state akin to the Dao, and it was like a Dao body. It was precisely such a solid and deep foundation that allowed it to seem so easy for Xianxia to cultivate the blood-tempering spirit control technique, and it could be said to have been accomplished without any extra effort. Senior White, this technique refined the blood to a state similar to lava, and then it benefits the soul and Dao foundation. Truly is unfathomably miraculous. Can you pass it down to me as well? Little Bao seemed extremely covetous as he watched from the side, and he couldn't help but seek guidance from Senior White. You? Senior White shot a sideways glance at Little Bao, and then he chuckled and shook his head. The technique that Temple Master passed down to you can be said to be peerlessly extraordinary and unique, yet you covet this technique of the last era. You really are greedy. Just tell me yes or no. Little Bao scratched his ears and head anxiously. Xianxia can cultivate this technique because his destiny and fate is concealed, and it allows him to avoid being detected and controlled by the current Heaven Dao. But you... Senior White puckered his lips. If you cultivate this technique, then it's equivalent to courting death. As it's said, the fortune of the past is a tribulation for the next generation. Something left behind from the last era may not necessarily be a good thing. When he heard all of this, Little Bao was shocked in his heart, and he glanced doubtfully at Senior White. In the end, he discarded that trace of hope in his heart. As they conversed, the imposing aura around Chen, she had suddenly retracted while the surging and rumbling vital blood in Xi's body seemed as if they'd returned to their source and had silently fallen into a dormant state. Looks like the side effects of the Godslaughter burst will be completely healed in around 2 hours from now. Senior White nodded to himself. Little Bao seemed to have noticed something, and a wisp of bright golden radiance suddenly suffused his eyes while he exclaimed with surprise via voice transmission, "Someone's coming!" In an instant, Xianxia was alarmed, and he awoke from his cultivation. He practically instinctively circulated the Dao seal mark to conceal the figures of Little Bao, Senior White, and himself. At practically the exact same moment that Xianxia had finished doing all of this, a circle of ripples suddenly arose in this expanse of the starry sky that was covered by the Tomb of Dragons, and then numerous figures appeared. Surprisingly, it was Imperial Monarch Taijing who was in the lead. However, at this moment he was gasping for breath. His expression was ashen and unsightly while his clothes were bloody and in rags. He seemed like a primeval ferocious beast that emanated a terrifying aura after being injured and infuriated. It wasn't just Imperial Monarch Taijing. The 4 universe-enlightened ancestral gods by his side had extremely unsightly expressions as well, and their faces were gloomy to the extreme. An entire 7 days of time. They'd been trapped within the Mirage Dragon's world for an entire 7 days of time, and they'd practically suffered the attacks of that Mirage Dragon at all times. With Imperial Monarch Taijing's combat strength, the 2 natural spirit treasures he possessed, and the assistance of over 10 universe-enlightened ancestral gods, they were actually not a match for that Mirage Dragon. This battle was extremely horrifying. During these 7 days of time, an entire 9-universe enlightened ancestral gods from their side were unable to persist in the battle and had been crushed on the spot. Their losses were so severe that it even caused them to feel despair. Even if it was at this moment when they'd arrived at the Tomb of Dragons, they still felt like it was unreal, and they felt extremely terrified. That really was too terrifying, someone muttered with an ashen expression. If we knew this would happen, we really shouldn't have come here. According to rumor, no one has even been able to survive here since the ancient times until now. Someone spoke with bitter regret. Imperial monarch Tai Jing calmed down instead when he heard all of this, and then he swept the surroundings with his gaze. He remained silent for a long time before he said indifferently, "Is it even possible to regret it now?" All of them went silent. They were naturally clearly aware that it was utterly impossible to regret their actions at this point, and they were just unable to calm down in their hearts. Since it's impossible to regret it, then we'll continue forward. Imperial monarch Tai Jing spoke word by word, and his voice emanated a wisp of resolution. If my deductions aren't wrong, then this expanse of the starry sky before us is an area called the Tomb of Dragons. So long as we traverse through it, then we'll arrive at the ancestral dragon Daelord's tomb. He paused for a moment and continued. This also means that supreme fortune is already close at hand. Their bodies shook while they swept the surroundings with their gazes in succession, and their originally dispirited and dejected emotions gradually brightened once more. But we still haven't located the target's tracks until now. It would seem to be slightly bad if we place all our attention on looking for this fortune. One of them hesitated for a moment and spoke in a low voice. The others were stunned, and their expressions changed indeterminately. Indeed, they'd come here for the sake of hunting that kid. But up until now, they actually hadn't even noticed a trace of him. If news of this were to be sent back to the clan, then the great figures of the clan would probably not forgive them. Do all of you think that kid has already perished here? After all, even we've suffered heavy losses while that kid is all alone. So, he would definitely be far inferior than us. One of them pondered deeply and analyzed. Even if he's alive, he's bound to be unable to escape this place. We can't allow him to lead us by the nose. One of them spoke with a gloomy expression. Imperial monarch Tai Jing couldn't help but frown as he listened to these discussions, and he said in a low voice, "How long more do all of you intend to continue discussing all of this here?" All of their faces froze, and they went silent like cicadas in the winter. "Set out." He merely lightly spat out 2 words from between his lips, and then Imperial monarch Tai Jing glanced coldly at all of them before his figure flashed towards the distance. The others exchanged glances when they saw this, and then they hurriedly chased after Imperial monarch Tai Jing. "Be careful and don't touch those dragon skeletons. Otherwise, even I would be unable to save all of you. Head this way. There's a unique aura being faintly emanated from there. Let's go investigate it." As they flew, Imperial monarch Tai Jing guided the others in order to prevent them from accidentally bringing down calamity to their group, and their group quickly vanished in the depths of the boundless starry sky. From the beginning until the end, they'd utterly not noticed that she was just beneath a dragon skeleton that wasn't too far away, and he'd heard and noticed everything. 1 imperial monarch and 4 universe enlightened ancestral gods. After a short moment, she frowned and said, "Looks like we have to make the best use of our time and continue on our journey. If those fellows obtain the fortune hidden here, then it would be difficult to reclaim it." You promised to help your ancestor, Senior White quickly interrupted. "Of course." She nodded, and then he took a deep breath before he said, "Let's go. My cultivation has more or less recovered." She didn't hesitate to immediately stand up and bring Little Bao and Senior White with him as he teleported through space. Swish! A spatial ripple swept out, and it surged through the death-silent and chilly Tomb of Dragons. As he moved through the extremely enormous skeletons of dragons, Xianxia's group was like a group of insects and seemed to be very tiny. It was truly impossible to imagine exactly what thoughts all these dragons that resided in Spectre Galaxy had when they allowed themselves to be buried alongside the ancestral dragon Daelord. These dragon skeletons are extremely rare and precious treasures, and if it was in the outside world, those cultivators would definitely fight to the death for them. Xianxia sighed with emotion in his heart. If he wasn't aware that touching these skeletons arbitrarily would cause an unimaginable calamity to descend, he would have been unable to restrain himself from plundering them a long time ago. Head that way, Senior White guided. Because Senior White had utilized the dragon tongue to converse with the Wilbrand left behind by that mirage dragon, so he possessed complete knowledge about everything here. However, Xianxia noticed that the path Senior White was guiding him on was actually the same path that Imperial Monarch Taijing's group had taken. This meant that Imperial Monarch Taijing's group might really be able to locate the fortune left behind by the ancestral dragon Dowlord. When he thought up to here, Xianxia's heart couldn't help but tremble, and he became vigilant. Roar! 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 10 minutes later, a wave of obscure and heavy roars that were filled with boundless killing intent faintly resounded from afar. Xianxia's eyes instantly narrowed. After heading forward a little longer, they left the area that was the Tomb of Dragons, and a deathly silent expanse of space appeared before their fields of vision. There were no stars, no light, and no sound. It was like an expanse of space that was completely devoid of vitality, and only a path created by a snow-white skeleton existed. It was established in space and extended off in the distance, and it seemed to have no end. The obscure and incomprehensible roar that were filled with killing intent had surged out from that skeleton. This scene was extremely horrifying. In a deathly silent and dark expanse of space, a seemingly boundless bone path had been established there. Along with the monstrous and obscure roars that surged throughout the surroundings, it seemed like a world-shocking battle had once occurred in the boundless years of the past, and even the killing intent from that battle hadn't dispersed until now. This is the battle roar of the dragon race, and it can be simply understood as the word, kill. Senior White's expression became solemn as he spoke swiftly. Xianxia, do you still remember the scene on Master Xian's Divine Mountain all those years ago? Xianxia nodded. Even until now, he still remembered that countless battle souls had been suppressed on that mountain. All of them were formidable gods that the master of the Mancha period, Xian, had captured, and he'd confined them on that mountain. If I'm not wrong, then this bone path is probably similar to Master Xian's Divine Mountain, and you'll definitely encounter a boundless repulsive and suppressive force once you step foot onto it. Moreover, this force will probably grow more and more terrifying the further you go. Senior White explained in a low voice, and then he instructed. You have to be careful. Since we've come, then we should naturally do our best. Xianxia smiled while a wisp of a firm expression suffused his eyes. As he spoke, he'd arrived before the bone path in that deathly silent expanse of space. Little Bao, prepare yourself. Xianxia glanced at Little Bao, and the latter grinned and indicated that he understood. Let's go. Xianxia's figure flashed, and then he stepped foot on the bone path. Suddenly, a strand of powerful killing intent pressed down upon him like a mountain, and the roar in the dragon tongue that was filled with the intent to kill resounded by his ears. Xianxia puckered his lips while his mind was firm like a rock and completely tranquil, and he circulated his cultivation before flashing forward. The pressure he experienced grew stronger at a rapid pace. When he's just stepped foot onto the path, the pressure was equivalent to the full force strike of a domain-enlightened spirit god. But as he went further ahead, this force rose steadily. It wasn't long before the pressure had actually arrived at a might that only a universe-enlightened ancestral god could attain. Rumble! The invisible pressure and repulsive force was like a torrent as it collided with Xianxia's figure, and it caused waves of rumbling to resound. It was like numerous universe-enlightened ancestral gods were attacking with the intention of crushing Xianxia on the spot. Ordinary universe-enlightened ancestral gods would probably be unable to endure all of this. Xianxia flicked his sleeve and rumbling resounded as he directly crushed the invisible pressure that smashed down from ahead. Fortunately, it isn't so dangerous for now. Xianxia continued forward as he flicked his sleeve to crush the invisible pressure. The invisible pressure was clearly created by some sort of ancient restriction of the dragon race. It pressed down ceaselessly like tidewater, and it grew stronger and stronger the further he went. Swoosh! After traveling for another short moment, Xianxia's brows immediately raised, and he withdrew the banished and slashed down with it. The banisher left behind a sharp mark in space as it blasted apart the pressure that assaulted him. After he arrived here, the pressure was already comparable to the might of a peak universe enlightened ancestral god, and it caused Xianxia to not dare deal with it barehanded any longer. After moving forward again for some time, Xianxia, rest for a while and let me take over. Little Bao had a deep-rooted passion for battle. So, after watching Xianxia move forward without difficulty all along the way, he'd been itching to have a go since a long time ago. At this moment, he couldn't restrain himself any longer and had made a move, and he raised his iron rod and smashed it down. Rumble! The pressure exploded into pieces and emanated deafening rumbling. Little Bao's eyes glowed, and he cried out loudly, "Awesome! Awesome!" As he spoke, he raised the iron rod and rampaged all the way forward in an extremely ferocious, violent manner. Senior White couldn't help but roll his eyes and mutter when he witnessed this scene. The monkeys in this world really are the same. They are thirsty for battle, wild, and seemingly mad. With Little Bao's assistance, Xianxia was instantly at ease, and he seized this opportunity to be finally able to divert his attention and size up the surroundings. As they moved further ahead, this expanse of space grew even more deathly silent and dark. It seemed like it was enveloped by an eternal veil of light or was like a dark abyss. On the other hand, the bone path beneath his feet still seemed to be so long, and it seemed as if it was endless. This caused Xianxia to be unable to help but ask, "Senior White, you said that the ancestral Dragon Daylord's tomb might lie at the end of this path?" "It most probably is." Senior White nodded. "But you have to be careful. That Imperial Monarch Taijing's group might be ahead. If worse comes to worse, I'll make another natural spirit treasure explode, or utilizing the Godslaughter burst again would work as well." Xianxia smiled while his eyes were filled with an expanse of piercing coldness instead. Obviously, he wasn't joking. Since he'd confirmed that Imperial Monarch Taijing's group was from the Xiaohao clan, he knew that they'd definitely come to kill him. Under such circumstances, even if he didn't kill them, they would still use every means possible to kill him. When he spoke up to hear, Xianxia suddenly noticed to his surprise that the bone path beneath his feet had suddenly broadened, and it was spreading towards the side like a fan. However, the pressure had suddenly increased as well. If the pressure from before could be described as a torrent, then the current pressure was like a floor or a powerful army. Good, good, good. Little Bao, on the other hand, was growing more and more excited as he fought. His figure suddenly transformed into the state of being 300 m tall and possessed 3 heads and 6 arms. He held the iron rod in hand as he waved it in a violent and ferocious manner, causing him to seem like a god of war that revealed a bearing of supremacy. Xianxia couldn't help but be lost in thought when he saw this. This gold-eyed rhesus monkey is a sprite of the heavens and the earth. Its natural talent is extraordinary, and it's born with a thirst for battle. That temple master of Aramba Temple didn't restrain his nature because of that, and the technique she passed down to him is one of the best combat techniques in the world. In this way, even though this little monkey's temperament would be unstable, violent, and ferocious, he would be able to improve himself through battle. It can be considered to be a cultivation technique that attains the Tao through battle. Senior White explained from the side, and then he chuckled and said, "That temple master was even willing to part with him and leave him by your side. With him by your side, it would undoubtedly be like having a supreme partner in battle. Little Bao has his own path to take. I won't take him to be a lackey or subordinate." Xianxia shook his head. Bang! Right at this moment, Little Bao's 300 m tall figure suddenly staggered back by a few steps, and he was actually shaken by the pressure to the point of falling into a slightly embarrassing state. Rumble! Right at this instant, the remaining pressure passed by Little Bao and smashed down towards Xianxia, and it rumbled and caused Xianxia's vital blood to roil. "Xianxia, watch out! The pressure is barely comparable to an imperial monarch now." Little Bao roared loudly and was about to charge forward. Not only was he not fearful at all, he'd become even more excited and ferocious. It was just as Senior White had said, Little Bao was that sort of existence that was born for battle. If this continues, then this little monkey won't be able to persist for long. Quickly take that dragon origin pearl of yours. Senior White instructed swiftly. He seemed to have expected this scene, so he seemed to be very calm and composed at this moment. The dragon origin pearl. It was a natural spirit treasure that Xianxia had seized from Jin Qingyang from the Imperial region's Jin clan, and he'd merely utilized it once when he dealt with Imperial Monarch Nandu on that day. At this moment, when he heard Senior White, Xianxia instantly came to an understanding. Merely hearing its name alone allowed one to realize that this natural spirit treasure was closely related to the dragon race. With a command in his heart, Xianxia had withdrawn the dragon origin pearl. I'll pass down a cultivation technique of the dragon race to you. After that, you'll be able to bring forth unbelievably miraculous effects when utilizing this treasure. As Senior White spoke, he transmitted a strand of obscure information into Xianxia's sea of consciousness. The Dragon Command Technique. It was an extremely domineering name, yet it was actually a technique that was passed down in the dragon race, and it was utilized to temper one's own dragon aura. It was a force that could deter the soul and crush the world. With Xianxia's comprehension ability, it practically took a mere moment before he'd completely comprehended the profundities of this technique. Bang! Meanwhile, Little Bao was blasted back once more, and he seemed to be grimacing in pain. But in merely an instant, he roared and intended to charge forward to continue the battle. Little Bao, come back here. Xianxia stopped Little Bao. As he spoke, he took a deep breath and circulated the Dragon Command Technique, causing his entire body to suddenly emanate a strand of extremely faint dragon aura. This strand of aura surged into the dragon origin pearl in his palm. In an instant, the fist-sized pearl suddenly emanated a myriad of strands of brilliant divine radiance, and then a resounding dragon howl shot into the sky. A strand of obscure, ancient, and desolate dragon energy that seemed chaotic was visible to the naked eye as it surged out like tidewater and swept out from the dragon origin pearl. Rumble! This dragon energy that swept out from the dragon origin pearl collided with the pressure. At this moment, the ladder that was originally comparable to the attack of an imperial monarch was easily shattered like glass, and it rumbled as it collapsed. It was completely crushed and suppressed. Xianxia couldn't help but be slightly surprised when he saw that the dragon origin pearl actually possessed such a terrifying might. But he quickly came to an understanding. The dragon origin pearl innately counteracted the pressure that suffused the bone path, and that was why it was capable of displaying such formidable might. However, at the same time, Xianxia clearly noticed that almost 20% of the divine energy within his body had been exhausted in this short period of a few breaths of time, and this consumption far exceeded the consumption of his divine energy in the past. Xianxia, even though the combination of the Dragon Origin Pearl and Dragon Command Technique can produce miraculous effects, its exhaustion of divine energy is extremely great. You have to balance your usage well and ask the monkey to withstand the pressure for you if you're unable to endure the consumption. Senior White quickly reminded Xianxia via voice transmission. According to Senior White, no matter if it was the Dragon Command Technique or the Dragon Origin Pearl, both of them were only suitable for members of the dragon race. The dragon race. Every single one of them was enormous like a winding mountain. So with their huge size, the divine energy they possessed was naturally extremely vast and far exceeded the amount of divine energy possessed by humans. So, when their cultivation technique and treasure was utilized by Xianxia now, the consumption of his divine energy was obvious. There's no need for that. Xianxia smiled. As he spoke, he controlled the Dragon Origin Pearl and strode forward once more. Rumble. During the next period of time, the pressure grew even more terrifying, and it was on par with the might of a true imperial monarch. It crushed space and emanated thunderous rumbling that seemed extremely shocking. The Dragon Origin Pearl glowed like a brilliant sun, and it emanated an obscure, ancient, and vast aura of a dragon that easily dissolved and disintegrated the pressure. Everything seemed to be extremely easy. However, Senior White was surprised and bewildered by this scene, because Xianxia actually showed no sign of exhaustion all along the way. The divine energy in Xianxia's body seemed to be endless, and it seemed to be extremely durable. This was extraordinarily unusual to Senior White. Looks like this kid definitely possesses a precious treasure that's capable of ceaselessly replenishing his divine energy. In the entire world, such miraculous ability seemed to be only possessed by. In the end, Senior White finally faintly guessed the answer, and his eyes instantly lit up. The divine dark parasol tree. What a surprise! No wonder I felt it was slightly unusual when I entered into closed-door cultivation in the universe within that kid's body. So, it turns out that he possesses such a precious treasure that was born from within the chaos. Senior White exclaimed with surprise. He'd originally thought that he'd seen through everything about Xianxia, yet now it would seem like it was clearly not the case. Xianxia. Suddenly, a cold and indifferent voice sounded out from afar. At practically the exact same time, Xianxia suddenly stopped moving, and his eyes were suffused with a piercingly cold glow as he glanced towards the distance. There was a group of figures standing around 30k ahead. Surprisingly, it was Imperial Monarch Taijing's group. However, at this moment, all of them had withdrawn their divine artifacts and were resisting the terrifying pressure with all their might. It seemed to be extremely strenuous for them, and they'd obviously been trapped here for a long time and were unable to move forward. When he noticed the arrival of Xianxia's group, Imperial Monarch Taijing's face instantly revealed a wisp of surprise, and then this surprise was replaced by gloominess. It really is that kid. He actually came to us after we've been searching for him for so long. The other universe enlightened ancestral god realm experts noticed Xianxia's group as well, and all of them were excited. Moreover, they revealed cold smiled while their eyes were filled with killing intent. Xianxia didn't reveal any panic when encountering his enemies here, and his eyes flowed with cold light while he seemed to be in deep thought instead. In the end, he shook his head and continued forward. He merely moved aside to avoid colliding with them and actually disregarded their entire group. I'll seize this opportunity to kill that kid. A universe-enlightened ancestral god on Imperial Monarch Taijing's side was unable to restrain himself and spoke in a ghastly tone. Idiot! Unexpectedly, Imperial Monarch Taijing's face sank, and he cursed. Feel free to go ahead if you want to die. That person was stunned, and then his expression changed indeterminately. 15th Elder is right. Don't be rash. We're currently trapped here, and we're unable to move forward or retreat. Under such circumstances, how would we kill this kid? One of them sighed with emotion. They'd already been trapped here for a long time, and even with Imperial Monarch Taijing's might, he was merely able to prevent them from being oppressed and blasted back. It isn't just that. Have all of you noticed? That kid is clearly just at the intermediate stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm, yet he caught up with us. This is extremely unusual. One of them revealed a solemn expression, and he glanced at Xianxia's group with an indeterminate expression. As soon as these words were spoken, the others were shocked as well, and they finally realized that Xianxia's group was unusual. How exactly did they accomplish it? One of them couldn't help but ask. The Jin clan's dragon origin pearl. Imperial Monarch Taijing, who hadn't spoken until now, had slightly spat out a few words, and his expression was extremely livid. However, I never expected that this kid actually cultivated in a secret technique of the dragon race, and he'd actually able to completely bring forth the might of that treasure. At this moment, all the others came to an understanding, and their expressions turned extremely unsightly. On the other hand, when they noticed that the figures of Xianxia's group were gradually catching up to them and faintly showed signs of surpassing them, all of their expressions turned gloomy to the extreme. Damn it! Isn't this little bastard's luck a bit too good? No matter if it was the Jade Rain Dao domain or the Mirage Dragon's world, they were actually unable to kill that kid. Now, he's merely relying on a single pearl to surpass us. This is too infuriating. What should we do? The tomb of the ancestral dragon Dao Lord lays right after this path. If that kid arrived before us, then this fortuitous encounter will probably. One of them had an unsightly expression. There's no need to be anxious. In terms of danger, The ancestral dragon Daelord's tomb would absolutely be even more terrifying than this place. It wouldn't be so easy for this kid to obtain that fortuitous encounter. Imperial Monarch Taijing took a deep breath and averted his gaze from Xianxia's group, and then he said in a low voice, "I'll utilize a secret technique later and break through this predicament in one go. All of you protect me until then." The dragon origin pearl fluctuated endlessly and emanated circle after circle of ripples of dragon aura, and it completely dispersed the pressure that surged over from ahead. At this point in time, even Xianxia couldn't help but feel pressured, because as he moved forward even deeper, the speed of exhaustion of his divine energy was ceaselessly increasing. Even if he utilized the divine dark parasol tree at full strength, he was merely barely able to maintain this sort of speed of advancement. The current pressure is probably comparable to an 8th-star Imperial Monarch. Senior White's expression turned solemn as he spoke quickly via voice transmission. "If your ancestor, I am not wrong, then you just have to persist for a short period of time before you'll be able to completely traverse this bone path." Xianxia nodded. His expression gradually turned solemn while his advance started slowing down as well. Moreover, his aura started becoming muddy. After another long period of time, Xianxia even had no choice but to stop, and he resisted the pressure that surged over ceaselessly while pouring all sorts of peerlessly rare divine herbs into his mouth in order to replenish his divine energy. Later on, Xianxia had to stop for almost 10 minutes after every single step he took forward, and this obviously showed how terrifying the exhaustion of his divine energy was. Bang! After Xianxia took another step forward, his entire body was suddenly relieved because they charged out from that area which was covered by the pressure. Huff! Huff! We've finally passed through that damnable place. Xianxia gasped for breath while he roared endlessly with laughter, and he actually seemed happy as if he'd gained new life. Without the presence of that pressure, for the first time ever, Xianxia felt that walking normally was an extremely rare joy. Senior White and Little Bao were extremely delighted as well. Even though the journey here wasn't dangerous enough to threaten their lives, it was truly too arduous. As they watched Xianxia break through all obstacles and move forward, both of them had been constantly worried and anxious for him. Now, when they'd finally passed through the bone path, it truly allowed them to heave long sighs of relief. After passing through the bone path, it was a starry sky suffused with mist that appeared before their eyes. Moreover, the outline of numerous divine mountains could be faintly noticed within the mist. Those divine mountains towered into the sky, and they were countless times larger than stars. Moreover, they were completely enveloped by gray and hazy mist, causing them to seem lofty and mysterious. Dragon Ridge! Senior White's eyes lit up, and he was unable to restrain his delight. That mirage dragon said that the ancestral dragon Daelord's corpse is buried in this expanse of mountains that floats in the starry sky. Oh! Xianxia's spirits couldn't help but be refreshed. Crack! Xianxia had just taken a stride forward when a bolt of lightning suddenly struck down. Fuck off! Xianxia hadn't even made a move before Little Bao swept his iron rod horizontally, and it directly destroyed that bolt of lightning. However, to Xianxia's surprise, even though Little Bao had destroyed this attack, Little Bao's body moved backward uncontrollably as well. Moreover, Little Bao coughed up a mouthful of blood. He'd actually been injured from this collision. Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning. Senior White had a solemn expression. Don't move forward for now. Once you're struck by this thing, it's really easy to be obliterated. It's a unique energy that only the ancestral dragon race that was born from within the chaos possessed. Xianxia's eyes narrowed, and he said with a solemn voice, "Doesn't this mean that Dragon Ridge is even more dangerous than the Bone Path?" "It's much more dangerous indeed. But so long as we possess the method to deal with it, then it isn't difficult and we'd only have to take a certain amount of risk." Senior White pondered deeply and seemed to be deducing something. Xianxia didn't disturb Senior White when he noticed this, and he started sizing up everything that lay in the distance. It's merely a tomb. Even if the ancestral dragon Daolord was respected as a peerless Daolord, but his tomb is actually filled with so many restrictions, dangers, and barriers. Isn't this a little too unusual? Why did that ancestral dragon Daolord do that? Could it be that all of this was done merely for the sake of protecting his corpse from being violated? It's definitely not so simple. She faintly had a feeling that there was probably some other secret hidden within the ancestral Dragon Daelord's tomb. How many years has it been? Yet no one has been able to step foot onto Dragon Ridge. I originally thought that it would be a peerless expert that arrived, but who would have expected that it would actually be a little child? How truly disappointing. I advise all of you to leave as soon as possible. Don't give your lives away for a fortuitous encounter that may not even exist. Suddenly, a sharp and hoarse voice suddenly sounded out from the gray and hazy mist in the distance. Someone is actually here? She was shocked in his heart, and he swiftly became alert and vigilant. Only now did he notice that the figure of a violet-clothed youth was sitting cross-legged on one of the divine mountains in the distance that were enveloped by mist. When she looked closely, she noticed the violet-clothed youth wore a violet-colored and lofty jade crow. He had a handsome expression, and a gaze that was cold, indifferent, and fierce to the extreme. He seemed to possess a youthful appearance, but she faintly sensed that the violet-clothed young man had probably lived for an extremely long time. Vital energy that forms a world, 9 stars that form a universe. This fellow is actually a 9th-star Imperial Monarch. Senior White noticed the violet-clothed young man at the same time, and he was immediately shocked and swiftly notified Shi in a slightly solemn voice. A 9th-star Imperial Monarch. Shi's heart shook fiercely. Who could have imagined that the violet-clothed young man would actually be in existence that was at the strongest level of the Imperial Monarch realm? However, it felt normal when he thought about it, because it was naturally impossible for ordinary figures to surmount the dangers all along the way to arrive here. After all, even Imperial Monarch Taijing was still trapped on the bone path right now. Even though they were both Imperial Monarchs, the violet-clothed young man was clearly much stronger than Imperial Monarch Taijing. But why was a 9th-star Imperial Monarch like this staying on Dragon Ridge and not going to search for the supreme fortune left behind by the ancestral Dragon Daelord? Obviously, there was definitely something strange about it. Suddenly, the violet-clothed young man on the distant divine mountain seemed to have noticed something, and he gazed at Shi while seeming to be lost in thought. A little kid at the intermediate stage of the universe enlightened ancestral god realm like you was actually able to charge out of the Jade Rain Dao domain, break through the Mirage Dragon's world, and surmount the Tomb of Dragons to ascend Dragonbone Ascension and arrive here in the end. This is slightly unusual. Which great power are you from? Who's your master? My master's name isn't something you have the right to know. Shi answered calmly while he'd roughly determined in his heart that this 9th-star Imperial Monarch was probably trapped here. Otherwise, the violet-clothed young man would have gone to search for the fortune left behind by the ancestral Dragon Daelord since a long time ago. How could he possibly have the time to talk nonsense with Shi? Haha, kid, you're too vigilant. Since I, Dong Bowen, started cultivating until now, I've always solemnly obeyed the rules between sex. So, how could I possibly harm a kid like you? The violet-clothed young man roared light-heartedly with laughter. Yet his gaze was carefully observing Shi's expression. Unfortunately, Shi's display was too calm, and it caused Dong Bowen to be utterly unable to determine anything useful from it. Dong Bowen? This name wasn't familiar to Shi, but he would absolutely not lower his guard because of something Dong Bowen had said. At the same time, Shi instructed Little Bao to be vigilant, and then he sent a voice transmission to Senior White. Have you thought of a way to pass through Dragon Ridge? It isn't difficult to deal with the Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning, and you just have to utilize the Dragon Origin Pearl in your hand as the catalyst and execute a secret technique to completely resolve the threat they pose. Senior White said via voice transmission. What I'm truly worried about is that there isn't just a single barrier on Dragon Ridge. Oh, Shi's eyes narrowed. Never mind. I advise you to leave as soon as possible. Even I've been trapped here for 8,000 years and was unable to obtain that fortune. The strength all of you possess is far insufficient. Dong Bowen shook his head and spoke. His expression seemed to be cold, fierce, and indifferent, but his voice didn't reveal any disdain or hostility. It was like he was describing an extremely ordinary matter. However, when Senior White heard these words, he was unable to endure it and couldn't help but grunt coldly. Just because you are trapped here doesn't mean that we'll be as well. Sometimes, strength isn't sufficient to decide everything. Dong Bowen was stunned, and his gaze shot over like cold bolts of lightning. He sized Senior White up for a long time, and then he couldn't help but reveal a wisp of wonder in the end and frown as he said, "What's your background, bird? You're only at the domain enlightened spirit god realm, yet you speak so haughtily. You truly don't know your place." Before Senior White could speak, he continued, "I'm not afraid to tell you that there are a total of 2 restrictions in Dragon Ridge. The first is the Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning, and it's almost impossible to take a step forward without the ability of a 6-star Imperial Monarch. The second restriction is beneath me. There are a total of 18 divine mountains here, and they were formed from the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Dowlord after he fell. It's so dangerous that it's utterly not something all of you can resist. According to my inference, it's probably only existence at the half-step Dowlord realm that might possess a slim chance of passing through this place." His words just happened to confirm Senior White's doubts from before, and it caused Xianxia's heart to sink involuntarily. Only a half-step Dowlord has a slim chance of success. That Dong Bowen would definitely not lie. Otherwise, why would he be trapped at the second restriction with his cultivation at the 9th-star Imperial Monarch realm? Ha ha! At this moment, Senior White laughter with ridicule for no rhyme or reason. He seemed to be disdainful yet also seemed to be ridiculing Dong Bowen for exaggerating. "Then why haven't you left?" When he noticed this, Xianxia hurriedly changed the topic in order to prevent Senior White's actions from infuriating Dong Bowen. "I'm unwilling to give up." Dong Bowen spoke indifferently. "I've already attained the 9th-star Imperial Monarch realm, and I don't know how long I'd have to wait in order to step into the Dowlord realm. Since it's like that, if I cultivate here, then perhaps I might encounter a favorable turn in the situation one day and obtain that fortune. Perhaps I would even be able to rely on it to charge into the Dowlord realm." Xianxia frowned when he heard this, and then he immediately fell silent. "Unfortunately, I'm afraid you won't have another chance in your entire lifetime." Senior White chuckled coldly. He was similarly determined to obtain this fortune, so Dong Bowen's words had faintly aroused a trace of a competitive feeling in him. "Oh!" Dong Bowen's eyes that were fierce like lightning instantly narrowed, and he stared at Senior White for a long time before he suddenly started smiling. However, his smile was filled with coldness. "All right. Allow me to see how a domain-enlightened spirit god like you dared to boast shamelessly like this." As soon as he finished speaking, he closed his eyes and started meditating once more. He paid no further attention to Xianxia's group. On the other hand, when he witnessed this scene, Xianxia couldn't help but be struck with a flash of understanding, and he glanced at Senior White while seeming to be lost in thought. "You're found a way to deal with it?" Senior White revealed a mysterious smile. "You'll understand when the time comes." After that, Senior White didn't delay and utilized his will to transfer the brand of a secret technique to Xianxia. After that, he said in a low voice, "After this secret technique is executed, it'll definitely damage the Dragon Origin Pearl. But don't worry, so long as we're able to pass through the first restriction, then your ancestor, I, guarantees that the might of this natural spirit treasure won't just recover, it'll even become much stronger. So long as we're able to pass through the first restriction, then it would be worth it even if the Dragon Origin Pearl is destroyed." Xianxia smiled and was indifferent towards this. After the time for an incense stick to burn, Xianxia had fully comprehended the secret technique he received from Senior White, and a wisp of surprise couldn't help but suffuse his eyes. This secret technique couldn't be said to be extremely profound, but it was extremely inconceivable. Xianxia didn't give it any more thought before he led Senior White and Little Bao along as he started moving forward. Rumble. As soon as he made a move, a wave of violent fluctuation suddenly arose in this expanse of the heavens and the earth, and then numerous brilliant bolts of lightning struck down. Die! 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 The lightning actually emanated a wave of furious dragon roars that carried terrifying killing intent. As they descended, They seemed like wave after wave of silver rivers raining down from the sky, and it was an extremely astonishing sight. This was dragon flame tribulation lightning, a form of divine punishment that came from the dragon race, and its might was extremely shocking. Just as Dong Bowen had said, it would at least require a strength at the 6-star Imperial Monarch realm to pass through this restriction. Chun Shi's expression couldn't help but turn solemn. OM. The dragon origin pearl floated up into midair before the tribulation lightning could descend, and then it suddenly started revolving madly. Divine radiance shot out chaotically from it, and it even shattered space into pieces as it transformed into a shocking revolving black hole. The strength of its revolutions was truly too powerful. It was like a gale that possessed the might to obliterate the world, and it intended to tear this expanse of the heavens and the earth into pieces. Bang! The first bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning struck down with unparalleled divine might. If it was at any other ordinary moment, no matter how confident Chun Shi was, it would definitely be shocked to the point of fleeing when encountering such an attack. He wouldn't dare to go head-on against it at all. It was even to the extent that, with little Bao's ferocious disposition, he couldn't help but feel a wave of terror and horror. Aren't they just courting death? When he heard the resounding rumbling of the tribulation lightning, Dong Bowen, who sat cross-legged on the distant mountain, had opened his eyes while he sighed in his heart. Swish! However, in the next instant, a wave of violent and sharp sounds of collision resounded, and it reverberated ceaselessly through the heavens and the earth, causing even Dong Bowen's eardrums to be uncomfortable. He frowned and couldn't help but open his eyes, turn around, and look over. When he saw the scene in the distance clearly, his expression couldn't help but freeze slightly. In a distant expanse of space, a pearl that was brilliant like the sun revolved madly while warping the space around it to the point of shattering into a black hole, whereas the bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning that struck down seemed like a silver snake that had fallen into a vortex. It collided and clashed frequently, yet it was unable to change the direction of its attack, and it was like it was being carried along by the tide and was made to revolve along with the vortex. The dragon origin pearl. Could it be that this kid is a descendant of the Jin clan? But when did such an extraordinary and heaven-defying disciple appear in the Jin clan? Right when Dong Bowen was surprised and bewildered, an enormous bang resounded. The bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning was actually forcefully tossed out from the vortex, and it descended towards the distance. This was a bolt of tribulation lightning that possessed unfathomable might. At this moment, it was actually tossed out like an iron spear. Such a scene caused Dong Bowen to be astounded. What technique is that? How could it be so inconceivable? When they witnessed this scene, Chan Shi, Senior White, and Little Bao heaved sighs of relief in their hearts. Succeeded. The secret technique Senior White passed down to Chan Shi was a method that utilized the dragon origin pearls might as a catalyst to divert the tribulation lightning, and it forcefully diverged the dragon flame tribulation lightning's attack from its original course. In this way, it would allow Chan Shi and the others to avoid the dangers of going head-on with the dragon flame tribulation lightning, and it could be said to be inconceivable. However, no matter if it was Dong Bowen or Chan Shi's group, never had any of them imagined that when that bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning was tossed out and hadn't struck down to the ground, a group of figures had appeared. Moreover, the position they appeared at just happened to be beneath that bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning. On the other hand, that shrill cry, which was filled with extreme terror, had come exactly from someone amongst that group of figures. This scene had occurred too suddenly, and it was too bizarre. It was simply like they'd made an appearance to allow themselves to be struck by lightning, and it was filled with coincidence. Not to mention Dong Bowen and Chan Shi's group, even that group of figures had probably never imagined that such a scene would occur. Let's turn back time and return to when Chan Shi's group still hadn't entered Dragon Ridge. On the Bone Path, when they saw Chan Shi's group surpass them and enter the area where the fortune left behind by the ancestral Dragon Downlord resided, the expressions of Imperial Monarch Tai Jing and the others turned completely livid. They were burning with anxiety in their hearts, and they were unable to allow that supreme fortune to be seized just like that by that little fellow who they were hunting. Stand on guard for me. Imperial Monarch Tai Jing took a deep breath and forcefully restrained the killing intent in his heart. At this moment, he didn't dare hold back at all and executed a secret technique. A myriad of strands of divine radiance arose from his body. They were dazzling and resplendent, and they formed the grand scenes of the changes in the universe, the passage of time, the circulation of the grand Tao, the gods chanting scriptures, and so on and so forth. Moreover, all of these serves surged endlessly in the heavens and the earth. In an instant, Imperial Monarch Taijing's imposing aura rose swiftly. He was like a god that ruled over all living beings, and he possessed an imposing aura of control and supremacy over the world. Moreover, along with the execution of this technique, Imperial Monarch Taijing's imposing aura grew more and more stronger, and this strengthening showed no signs of stopping. Rumble. During this process, strands pressure that were like violent tidal waves assaulted them incessantly on the bone path. However, all the pressure was resisted by the four universe-enlightened ancestral gods that were already ready for battle, and they won Imperial Monarch Taijing even more time to execute his secret technique. However, they were merely universe-enlightened ancestral gods in the end. Even Imperial Monarch Taijing was trapped here and unable to move forward at all, let alone them. Pooh! After merely a short moment of time, one of the universe-enlightened ancestral gods coughed up blood while his figure staggered back, and he was almost annihilated on the path. After 10 more minutes passed, the other 3 universe-enlightened ancestral gods were unable to persist successively, and all of them coughed up blood while their countenances turned ghastly pale. They were like straw that were struggling beneath a violent gale, and they were in a precarious situation. When they were just about to suffer calamity and perish, Imperial Monarch Taijing, who'd remained still all this time, had suddenly opened his eyes at this critical moment. Bang! A strand of extremely terrifying pressure rumbled out from Imperial Monarch Taijing's body. It was an autumn gale sweeping through leaves as it instantly crushed all the pressure that surged over into powder. It could be said to have encountered no resistance and was all-powerful. He succeeded. All 4 of the universe-enlightened ancestral gods were excited, and the feeling of escaping death simply felt indescribable to them. Let's go. We must kill that kid. We absolutely can't allow that kid to obtain the fortune left behind by the ancestral dragon Tao Lord. At this moment, Imperial Monarch Taijing revealed a powerful, imposing aura. His entire body was suffused with a form of indescribably violent aura, and it was more than 2 times stronger than before. As he spoke, he suddenly took a step forward. Everywhere he passed, the pressure that surged over incessantly was actually like pierce of paper that were destroyed and dispersed successively. They weren't able to resist his might at all. Amazing! 15 Elder. If I'm not wrong, then the secret technique that 15th Elder executed is probably one of the 8 ultimate techniques of the Xiaohao clan, the blood transformation Dao fuse technique. Right? The blood transformation Dao fuse technique? My God! No wonder it's so formidable. So it was this technique. According to rumor, it's a secret technique that isn't inferior to the Yazi clan's Godslaughter Burst technique. The 4 universe-enlightened ancestral gods that followed by Imperial Monarch Taijing's side exclaimed endlessly with admiration, and they were extremely surprised by the ability that Imperial Monarch Taijing displayed. Imperial Monarch Taijing's expression was cold, yet he was extremely complacent in his heart, and he really enjoyed this sort of feeling of being praised and respected. Let's go kill that kid first. It wouldn't be too late to celebrate after we seize the fortune left behind by the ancestral dragon Tao Lord. Imperial Monarch Taijing spoke indifferently before he suddenly shook his arms and closed them together as if he was embracing both the yin and yang in the world. Bang! This action of his completely obliterated the last strand of pressure that stood before him. Of course, 15th Elder is absolutely right. The universe-enlightened ancestral gods nodded successively. If nothing unexpected occurs, then Dragon Ridge lays at the other side of this path, and that kid is definitely trapped there now. A wisp of dense killing intent arose in Imperial Monarch Taijing's eyes, and he didn't stop at all before taking a stride through the end of the path. The other universe-enlightened ancestral gods hurriedly followed him when they saw this, and they rubbed their palms together while truly wishing for nothing more than to skin Xianxia alive before burning his bones and scattering his ashes. That damnable little bastard. Let me see if he's able to escape this time. Haha. We must not be in a hurry to kill him this time. A little bastard like him has to be tortured to the point that living is worse than death. Only then would it be satisfying. Exactly. When the time comes, I'll torture him nicely. As they discussed, all of them followed behind Imperial Monarch Taijing and arrived at Dragon Ridge. After that, all of them hadn't even had the time to see the appearance of Dragon Ridge clearly when a world-shocking bolt of lightning blasted down towards them. At this instant, it seemed as if time had frozen. Imperial Monarch Taijing's eyes narrowed while he instinctively dodged to the side with full force. On the other hand, the expressions of the four universe enlightened ancestral gods by his side turned grim instead, and they were shocked to the point their souls almost left their bodies. They similarly intended to dodge instinctively, but they were slightly slower than Imperial Monarch Taijing. Bang! The bolt of tribulation lightning struck down and struck right onto one of the universe-enlightened ancestral gods. That universe-enlightened ancestral god merely had the time to let out a shrill cry before his entire body was blasted into ash, and his soul was obliterated on the spot. Imperial Monarch Taijing's heart constricted when he witnessed this scene, and his eyes narrowed. His gaze shot out like a bolt of lightning, and he instantly noticed that Xianxia's group was surprisingly standing in the area around 3 kilometers away. On the other hand, the other 3 universe-enlightened ancestral gods were shocked by this scene to the point their entire bodies trembled, and they were filled with rage. Earlier, they were excitedly discussing how they would deal with Xianxia, but in the blink of an eye, one of their companions had completely vanished from the world. How could they be able to accept such a huge difference in the situation? It really is that kid. Imperial Monarch Taijing spat out a few words from between his lips, and it sounded like it was squeezed out from the cracks between his teeth and carried boundless killing intent. Damn it! It was definitely that little bastard who launched a surprise attack against us. The 3 remaining universe-enlightened ancestral gods were surprised, and they recovered from their shocked states. When they saw Xianxia and the others who stood in the distance, both past and current enmity surged into their hearts, causing their expressions to become livid and ghastly to the extreme. Meanwhile, Xianxia and the others had finally recognized Imperial Monarch Taijing's group, and they couldn't help but feel slightly surprised because they'd never expected that Imperial Monarch Taijing's group would catch up so quickly. However, they couldn't help but laugh right after that. They arrived quickly but arrived at the right time, because a bolt of dragon flame tribulation lightning that was diverted away had actually annihilated a universe-enlightened ancestral god from their side by coincidence. Damnable bastards! You actually dare to laugh. One of the universe-enlightened ancestral gods was infuriated, and he intended to charge forward and annihilate Xianxia. Bang! However, right at this moment, a strand of lightning suddenly struck down from the sky that was enveloped by mist. It terrified that universe-enlightened ancestral god to the point his entire body stiffened, and he instinctively dodged to the side. But when he noticed that strand of tribulation lightning was attacking Xianxia's group, he couldn't help but feel a wave of rage and embarrassment, and he felt like his action of dodging just now was too humiliating. However, in merely an instant, he started taking pleasure in Xianxia's group's misfortune. How could this bolt of tribulation lightning be unable to strike that damnable little bastard to death? But to his astonishment, after that bolt of tribulation lightning descended, it was drawn over by the vortex that the dragon origin pearl had formed in midair, and it revolved uncontrollably with the vortex and was completely diverted from its actual trajectory of attack. When looked at from afar, it was like Xianxia had utilized the dragon origin pearl to control the tribulation lightning. At this moment, even the pupils of Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others couldn't help but constrict while their hearts twitched fiercely. They almost didn't dare believe their eyes. That's dragon flame tribulation lightning. How could it possibly be controlled? Crack! Before they could recover from their shock, that bolt of tribulation lightning was suddenly tossed out by the vortex, and it struck down fiercely towards them at an even swifter speed. In an instant, Imperial Monarch Taijing was shocked by this scene to the point his expression changed once more, and he hurriedly dodged while seeming to be in an extremely embarrassing state. But even then, a universe-enlightened ancestral god was still grazer by this bolt of tribulation lightning, and his left arm was blasted into powder and transformed into ash that dispersed into the surroundings. Ah! That person couldn't help but let out a shrill cry from the extreme pain. This caused Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others to be both shocked and furious. They finally understood that the bolt of tribulation lightning from before which had annihilated their companion had clearly come from Chan Shi. All of this had occurred because of Chun Shi indeed. However, the first bolt of lightning wasn't something he'd targeted at them, and it was merely a coincidence. However, it was precisely this coincidence that caused a flash of inspiration to suddenly arise in his heart, and he aroused the thought to control the tribulation lightning. Thus, the matter of this second bolt of tribulation lightning had arisen. Through this test, Chun Shi finally noticed that if he utilized the secret technique Senior White passed down to him and supplemented it with the Dragon Origin Pearl in his hand, then he was entirely able to control the tribulation lightning's diverted direction and path. Even though he wasn't controlling it directly, its might was definitely formidable beyond imagination. Attack together and kill that kid. Right, we can't allow this to continue. Otherwise, we're bound to suffer even heavier losses. Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others immediately decided and reacted. They intended to annihilate Chun Shi because only in that way would they be able to resolve the precarious situation they were in. Unfortunately, Chun Shi wouldn't give them this opportunity. At the instant Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others made a move, Chun Shi made his move as well. However, his move was to take a stride towards the area covered in dragon flame tribulation lightning. Bang! 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 It was just as the 9th star Imperial Monarch Dongboan had said. When he entered into the area that was covered by the dragon flame tribulation lightning, the tribulation lightning suddenly became violent and dense. Moreover, numerous strands of bright silver rays of light struck down. With the experience he obtained from the last 2 bolts of tribulation lightning, Chun Shi seemed to be extremely composed this time. He controlled the Dragon Origin Pearl and executed the secret technique to form a spatial vortex that floated in midair and revolved madly without end. On the other hand, as soon as those bolts of tribulation lighting that possessed shocking might descended, all of them were drawn over by the vortex without exception. They were diverted from their original trajectory, and then they were forcefully tossed out according to Chun Shi's will, causing them to strike down towards Imperial Monarch Taijing. Shit! Dodge! Quickly! Damn it! The expressions of Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others sank when they saw this, and they were shocked, furious, and aggrieved in their hearts. How could they have imagined that dignified great figures belonging to the Xiaohao clan like them, who even had an imperial monarch residing amongst them, would actually fall into a state of being completely controlled by a young man at the intermediate stage of the universe? Enlightened ancestral god realm? However, no matter how furious and aggrieved they were in their hearts, they didn't dare slack off at all under such circumstances, and they instinctively dodged and resisted while not daring to go head-on against the dragon flame tribulation lightning. Rumble! Rumble! For a time, this area was filled with the rumbling of tribulation lightning. It was like numerous meteors were descending from outer space, and they smashed down to the point space exploded into pieces, the ground cracked apart, and the entire heavens and the earth showed signs of collapse and falling into chaos. On the other hand, Imperial Monarch Taijing's group was like a group of clowns that were forced to dodge successively, and they were in an extremely embarrassing state. Crack! Even if they dodged repeatedly, one of the universe's enlightened ancestral gods was still struck by the dragon flame tribulation lightning, and he was blasted to death on the spot. Moreover, his entire body and soul were instantly transformed into powder that vanished into nothingness. This scene shocked Imperial Monarch Taijing and the others to the point their hearts shook, and their expressions changed indeterminately. Moreover, they grew even more furious, and they were angered to the point of being on the verge of spitting blood. It was merely a young man at the intermediate stage of the universe's enlightened ancestral god realm, yet he'd relied on the dragon flame tribulation lightning to successively annihilate 2 universe enlightened ancestral gods from their side. How could they accept this? Bastard! Imperial Monarch Taijing was even more infuriated, and he roared loudly. However, before he could even make a move, he heard rumbling resound as another string of tribulation lightning struck down, and it caused his voice to stop abruptly while he couldn't help but dodge in a sorry state. If the cultivators of the outside world saw his furious and aggrieved appearance, they would definitely laugh their heads off. On the other hand, the last two remaining universe-enlightened ancestral gods by Imperial Monarch Tai Jing's side weren't so lucky, and they were successively slaughtered in the following period of time. This was why the Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning was terrifying. It was from the first restriction of Dragon Ridge, and it was set up by the ancestral Dragon Downlord all those years ago. It contained his strength, and it was utterly extraordinary. Damn it! Imperial Monarch Tai Jing was in a thundering rage, and his eyes almost split apart from it. As an elder of the Xiaohao clan that possessed monstrous authority, and as an imperial monarch that possessed unparalleled divine might, when had he ever suffered such a setback and humiliation since he started cultivating until now? He was merely pursuing a nobody, yet it caused all the universe-enlightened ancestral gods he brought along with him to be annihilated. If news of this were to spread, then how would the entire world look upon him, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing? Moreover, how would he give an explanation to the clan? Imperial Monarch Tai Jing was utterly furious, and it was even to the extent that he was on the verge of going berserk. His face had warped and turned savage, and he was like a furious primeval ferocious beast that emanated an extremely terrifying imposing aura. Rumble! Divine flames erupted explosively from his entire body, causing him to seem like a peerless god of devils that had descended to the world, and he roared loudly as he charged towards the distance. Even though he'd lost all of his subordinates, being alone had allowed him to be ridden of all restraints, and he didn't have to distract himself to protect the others any longer. Under such circumstances, it actually allowed him to resist the bolts of tribulation lightning that struck down towards him, and he started to approach the depths of Dragon Ridge. However, compared to Xianxia's group, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing's speed was clearly much slower. The reason was that Xianxia had utilized the Dragon Origin Pearl to divert all the tribulation lightning to Imperial Monarch Tai Jing. On the other hand, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing could only rely on his own strength to resist it directly. Under such circumstances, it was utterly impossible for him to immediately catch up to Xianxia. However, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing couldn't be bothered about all of this. He only had a single thought in his heart, and it was to charge out of this area and kill Xianxia no matter what. The Xiaohao clan? I never expected that they would actually be reduced to such a state by a young man from the Jin clan. They've really lost all face. On the peak of a mountain in the distance, Dong Bowen, who wore violet clothes, had already discerned the identities of Imperial Monarch Tai Jing and the others, and he couldn't help but shake his head when he saw those universe-enlightened ancestral gods being struck to death by the tribulation lightning. But right after that, Dong Bowen's eyes were suffused with an unusual glow. Wait! The Jin clan is just like the Xiaohao clan, and both of them had close relationships with the sovereign sect. These two sects shouldn't be in such confrontation. Could it be that young man isn't a descendant of the Jin clan? So, in this way, the Dragon Origin Pearl he possesses is probably not something he should possess. Earlier, Dong Bowen had instinctively taken Xianxia to be a member of the Jin clan because of the Dragon Origin Pearl, but he suddenly realized now that his judgment from before was mistaken. What a strange little fellow. He's at the intermediate stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm, yet he passed through numerous barriers to step foot onto Dragon Ridge. Moreover, there's a gold-eyed rhesus monkey and strange bird of mysterious origins by his side. Now, he has even taken control of the Jin clan's natural spirit treasure, the Dragon Origin Pearl. All of this makes him seem extremely mysterious. Dong Bowen had a deeper feeling of how extraordinary Xianxia was the more he thought about it, and he couldn't help but look once more at Xianxia. He noticed Xianxia moving step by step with a composed disposition towards the depths of the first restriction, and Xianxia was already on the verge of approaching him. Moreover, because of his possession of the Dragon Origin Pearl, the Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning that struck down incessantly were unable to harm Xianxia at all. No wonder that strange bird dared to speak so arrogantly. They really might be able to arrive before the second restriction by relying on that treasure. Earlier, Senior White had constantly engaged in a verbal argument with Dong Bowen, and it caused the latter to faintly feel a trace of displeasure in his heart. However, when he witnessed this scene, Dong Bowen couldn't help but be slightly moved, and he withdrew the trace of contempt he had in his heart. Humph! What are you looking at? Are you regretting that you spoke too confidently? Senior White noticed Dong Bowen's gaze as soon as he raised his head, and he couldn't help but raise his chest proudly and grunt coldly. Haha! I really didn't expect that you'd actually possess the Dragon Origin Pearl. But don't be so sure of yourselves. Even though you've surmounted the first restriction, the second restriction. Dong Bowen's voice was casual, and as he finished speaking, he grinned as he withdrew his gaze and didn't say anything else. Obviously, he didn't think that Xianxia's group would be able to traverse the second restriction. Heh! I'll say the same thing I said just now. If you're unable to accomplish it, it doesn't mean that we're unable to as well. Just wait and see. Senior White laughed coldly. During this entire process, Xianxia didn't say a single word because his entire attention was placed on dealing with and controlling the Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning. When he watched the universe enlightened ancestral gods by Imperial Monarch Taijing's side being annihilated successively, he couldn't help but feel extremely happy. He was originally heading back to Oracle Mountain, yet he was obstructed by these fellows on the way, and they seemed as if they wanted to annihilate him. This caused Xianxia to be unable to avoid feeling infuriated. Because of this, Xianxia had even been forced to flee into Spectre Galaxy and flee without end. At this point in time, the situation had finally started to turn around, and it had become advantageous to him, so he naturally couldn't help but feel extremely delighted. However, Xianxia didn't dare be careless. Because even until this very moment, Imperial Monarch Taijing was still completely unharmed and was gradually approaching him. Xianxia had fought Imperial Monarch Nandu earlier, and he was extremely clearly aware how difficult and dangerous it was to kill an Imperial Monarch. Moreover, according to his judgment, Imperial Monarch Taijing's strength was much stronger than Imperial Monarch Nandu, so he naturally didn't dare be careless. Under such circumstances, the only thing he could do was make the best use of his time to surmount this area that was covered by Dragon Flame Tribulation Lightning and ceaselessly pull apart the distance between Imperial Monarch Taijing and himself, so as to avoid a head-on collision with Imperial Monarch Taijing. Bang! 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 Along with the passage of time, numerous brilliant bolts of tribulation lightning struck down incessantly. They rumbled and surged through the surroundings, and they were filled with an aura of obliteration. Xianxia's group was moving forward. Dong Bowen had already closed his eyes and entered into a meditative state on the distant mountain, and he paid no further attention to all of this. At this moment, even Imperial Monarch Taijing had recovered his calm. His expression was icy cold and murderous while he moved forward against the bolts of tribulation lightning that struck down towards him, and his entire body was coiled with killing intent and flowed with divine radiance, causing him to seem extremely terrifying. After the time for an incense stick to burn, rumbling resounded while Xianxia felt his entire body relax. He'd left the area covered by the first restriction, and he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. We finally made it out of the area covered by the first restriction. It really is as Senior White said, the Dragon Origin Pearl has already suffered a great deal of damage. As he gazed at the treasure in his palm, he noticed it was completely dim while its aura wasn't as bright and perfect as it was earlier. It was like a brilliant pearl that had been mottled by some dust and dirt. This was a natural spirit treasure, yet it was damaged to such an extent so its might would definitely weaken greatly. If any other cultivator witnessed this, that person's heart would definitely bleed because of it. However, Xianxia was extremely satisfied because it was absolutely worth it since he was able to safely traverse the first restriction with the help of this treasure. Xianxia turned around and glanced into the distance. He noticed Imperial Monarch Taijing's figure approaching from extremely far away. Even though Imperial Monarch Taijing was slow, it wouldn't be long before Imperial Monarch Taijing would traverse the first restriction as well. This caused Xianxia to be unable to help but frown, and he swiftly said via voice transmission, "Senior White, how should we deal with the second restriction?" According to Dong Bowen, the second restriction was the 18 divine mountains before their eyes, and these divine mountains were formed by the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Downlord when he perished. It was so dangerous that only existences at the half-step Downlord realm had a chance of passing through it. It was precisely because of this that even though Dong Bowen was a 9th-star Imperial Monarch, He'd still been trapped here for 8,000 years and was unable to take a single step forward. This clearly showed how terrifying the second restriction was. This method of mine is slightly risky, but we can give it a try. Senior White went silent for a moment before he revealed a rare solemn expression. The quintessence energy of a Tao Lord is too strong. Even if it's the energy left behind after the Tao Lord suffered tribulation and perished, it's still sufficient to annihilate all existences below the Tao Lord realm. Xianxia's heart shook, and then he asked, "Exactly what method is it?" Senior White smiled when he heard this, and he said, "Remember what your ancestor I said earlier. If this method works, then it wouldn't just allow you to pass smoothly through the second restriction, you'll even be able to completely repair the dragon origin pearl and allow its might to grow even stronger." Xianxia couldn't help but frown, and he said angrily, "I asked you what the method is." Senior White didn't conceal it any longer, and he swiftly said to Xianxia via voice transmission, "After being left behind until now, the quintessence energy of a Tao Lord is shapeless and immaterial, yet it's filled with extraordinary killing intent. It's practically impossible to take precautions against it and resist it. But don't forget that the overarching heaven net in your possession is capable of capturing any ethereal, unreal, and imperceptible force in the world." Before Senior White could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Xianxia. "The overarching heaven net is extraordinary indeed. But if it's utilized with my strength, then it'll probably be unable to accomplish that at all." Senior White said indifferently, "How would you know the outcome without giving it a try? This is the risk that I spoke of. However, fortune is sought from amidst danger. How could there be a completely perfect and safe method in this world?" Xianxia instantly became hesitant. Should I try it or not? Hesitation represented some sort of worry. It was absolutely not taking a risk to pass through the second restriction by utilizing the overarching heaven net that worried Xianxia, and the crux was that a ninth-star imperial monarch resided on the peak of a distant mountain. Even though Dong Bowen hadn't revealed any hostile intentions, Xianxia didn't dare be careless at all. Not to mention that there was another imperial monarch approaching incessantly, and it caused Xianxia to have no choice but be even more vigilant. "You're worried about that ninth-star imperial monarch?" Senior White seemed to have seen through Xianxia's thoughts, and he couldn't help but speak via voice transmission. "Don't worry, that fellow is trapped there, and it's extremely difficult for him to make a single movement. If he wants to seize the opportunity to make a move against us, then he first has to resist the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Tao Lord that fills that area." Senior White paused for a moment and continued, "So long as we take him by surprise and enter the second restriction in advance, then he's bound to be unable to do anything to us." Xianxia frowned and said, "How do we take him by surprise?" Senior White couldn't help but smile complacently. "Could it be that you still haven't noticed? That fellow obviously thinks that we're unable to pass through the second restriction. Under such circumstances, he wouldn't make a move against a junior with his status as an imperial monarch. On the contrary, he'll even watch coldly from the sidelines and see exactly what methods we'll use to try and pass through the second restriction. This is exactly our opportunity." Xianxia pondered deeply for a moment, and he nodded in agreement in the end. In next to no time, Xianxia's group had arrived at the peak of the first divine mountain. "Ha! All of you really intend to traverse the second restriction." Dong Bowen opened his eyes, and he glanced at Xianxia's group who were 3 kilometers away from him and couldn't help but laugh lightheartedly. "What? Are you worried that we'll really pass through it and cause a ninth-star imperial monarch like you to seem extremely useless?" Senior White ridiculed and wasn't afraid of Dong Bowen at all. "You really have a foul mouth, bird. Never mind, I won't make a fuss about it with you. Since you intend to court death, then feel free to do so." Dong Bowen seemed to be extremely poised, and he merely shook his head, smiled, and couldn't be bothered to make a fuss about it with Senior White. Senior White laughed complacently instead. He desired this exact effect, because if Dong Bowen disregarded everything to obstruct them, then the consequences would be unimaginable. However, from the beginning until the end, Xianxia hadn't paid any attention to what was happening here, and he'd been carefully sizing up everything in the distance since he arrived at the peak of the mountain. This mountain beneath their feet towered into the clouds, and it was the first mountain within the first restriction. When one looked into the distance from here, there were another 17 divine mountains respectively standing towering in the distance. Every single divine mountain was ancient and mighty. They were suffused with a horrifying aura that was obscure and mysterious, and they seemed like boundless abysses that could swallow all outsiders. This was the second restriction of Dragon Ridge, and it was the final barrier to the ancestral Dragon Daelord's tomb. Since the ancient times until now, countless world-shocking figures had stopped and perished here. "Are you ready?" Senior White's voice sounded out by his ears. Xianxia nodded, and then he took a deep breath and hied Little Bao away according to Senior White's instructions. They did this in order to prevent Little Bao from suffering any mishaps while Xianxia passed through the second restriction. After he did all of this, Xianxia's eyes were filled with a firm expression as he said, "Let's begin." As he spoke, he strode forward and strode through the sky. Right at the moment he took a step off the first divine mountain, an ancient, mysterious, and vast fluctuation suddenly swept through this expanse of the heavens and the earth. It caused the heavens and the earth to dim down while all things suddenly warped at this moment. The sky became pitch black and seemed to have fallen into eternal darkness. Such a scene simply seemed like the end of the world had arrived, and it intended to annihilate everything. It was extremely shocking. Rumble. Suddenly, a strand of world-shocking resounded. She felt something flash before his eyes, and then a figure actually floated up into appearance in the distant space. That figure was an entire 30 kilometers tall. Its head seemed to hold the sky up while its feet reached the ground, and it stood towering in the heavens and the earth as if it had been standing there for a myriad of years and remained immovable for eternity. At practically the exact same moment, a strand of an ancient aura suddenly swept out from this 30 kilometers tall figure. In the next instant, numerous strands of brilliant and dazzling golden light surged into appearance, and it flowed through every single inch of the figure's skin. Rumble. This figure's imposing aura was too astonishing and boundless. While merely standing there, its vital energy rumbled like the Grand Tao, and it caused the sound of chanting to resound and ripple out. At this instant, this expanse of the heavens and the earth seemed as if it was filled by that mighty figure. The might figure was covered in golden light, and it possessed boundless might. It was like an innate god that had awakened from death, and it caused others to unconsciously have the feeling of being tiny before it. That's... Xianxia was extremely shocked in his heart, and he gasped. Even if he was clearly aware that the second restriction was extremely terrifying, he still couldn't help but shudder with fear when he saw the 30 kilometers tall ancient figure, and he sensed a form of lethal danger. There's no need to be afraid. This is formed from the quintessence energy left behind by the ancestral Dragon Daelord. Even though it's terrifying, it doesn't possess any intelligence. You just have to do as I instructed. Senior White had an unusually solemn expression as he swiftly reminded Xianxia. Xianxia nodded, and he was just about to do something when he heard Dong Bowen suddenly speak. That fellow is the dragon quintessence soul that the ancestral Dragon Daelord left behind before his death. I've fought it for 8,000 years and executed all sorts of abilities, yet I've never been able to subdue it. Do all of you really intend to court death? Xianxia paused for a moment, but he disregarded Dong Bowen's words in the end. Xianxia withdrew the dragon origin pearl, and it revolved in midair while emanating strands of ancient fluctuations of dragon energy. After that, he strode forward. What a stubborn little fellow. Since you intend to stubbornly seek death, then don't say that I didn't warn you. Dong Bowen couldn't help but shake his head. He originally intended to close his eyes and meditate, yet he was unable to restrain himself in the end and shot his gaze over. He was curious as well. Exactly where did a young man at the intermediate stage of the universe enlightened ancestral god realm get such confidence to actually dare to try and traverse a restriction that even half-step Daelords would find difficult to deal with? Bang! Right at the moment Xianxia took a stride forward, the mighty figure suddenly turned its head, and its eyes that were like scorching suns shot down. Its gaze actually seemed material, and it pierced through space and instantly locked onto Xianxia. In an instant, Xianxia felt his soul shudder while terror crept throughout his body. The hairs on his entire body stood on end while his figure stiffened on the spot. OM. The dragon origin pearl glowed in midair while emanating ancient dragon energy. The dragon energy enveloped Xianxia and actually gradually expelled and dispersed the deterrence that he suffered. A muddy and obscure voice rumbled like muffled thunder from within the 30 kilometers tall figure, and it seemed to be slightly bewildered. It really is as I expected. This fellow is formed from the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy, and it's of the same origin as the energy within the dragon origin pearl. Under such circumstances, it won't make a move against you in a short period of time. Senior White suddenly became excited, and he said swiftly via voice transmission, "Quickly, quickly, quickly. Withdraw the overarching heaven net and restrain this fellow in one go." But in that way, would it be infuriated and attack? Xianxia frowned. Even if you don't make a move against it, do you think it'll just watch as you pass through this area? Senior White spoke angrily. Xianxia's eyes narrowed. In the end, he gritted his teeth and suddenly raised his hand before making a tossing motion. A ball of light that was chilly like starlight swept out, and it suddenly transformed into a large net in midair. Moreover, this net actually easily restrained the 30 kilometers tall figure. At practically the exact same moment, Dong Bowen's surprised exclaim sounded out from behind. The overarching heaven net. So, you're a disciple of Oracle Mountain. Shit, Senior White exclaimed in his heart, and then he shouted explosively. Xianxia, what are you standing there for? Quickly take action. There was utterly no need for Senior White to remind him. Xianxia had realized the situation was pressing a long time ago, and he immediately circulated his entire cultivation, causing a myriad of strands of divine radiance to sweep out. After that, he suddenly let out a long howl as he forcefully hurled the dragon origin pearl out. Its target was precisely the 30 kilometers tall figure that was restrained by the overarching heaven net. However, even though he was quick, the figure formed from the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy was even swifter. When it was restrained by the overarching heaven net, it let out a deep and cold grunt, and then lightly raised its hand before causing rumbling to resound as it grasped and raised the large net that covered its body. Shockingly, its hand was densely covered in blue scales, and it was a sharp dragon claw that was filled with numerous mysterious and noble markings. The might revealed by this dragon claw was terrifying. The overarching heaven net was simply like Kakin that couldn't provide any resistance at all, and it was easily lifted before being forcefully pulled down. Moreover, it seemed as if it intended to crush the overarching heaven net into pieces. Shit! Xianxia and Senior White's expressions changed simultaneously. In their plan, Xianxia was to first restrain the mighty figure with the overarching heaven net, and then utilize the dragon origin pearl to absorb the energy within that mighty figure. After all, the dragon origin pearl and the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy were both innate energy of the dragon race, and they came from the same sources. So long as the dragon origin pearl entered that 30 kilometers tall body, then it would absolutely not cause the mighty figure to resist. In this way, Xianxia could control the dragon origin pearl to absorb its strength and accomplish his goal of annihilating the mighty figure. However, both Xianxia and Senior White had never expected that the 30 kilometers tall figure's strength would actually be so terrifying. Even a peerless divine treasure like the overarching heaven net was so weak before its attack, and it instantly took them by surprise. The most terrible thing was that even though the 30 kilometers tall figure hadn't destroyed the overarching heaven net, it had suddenly stretched out its claw and clawed down towards Xianxia and Senior White. Bang! That dragon claw was covered in blue scales and obscure and noble dragon markings. It was like a screen that blotted out the sky as it crushed down. The sky seemed as if it was on the verge of collapse beneath it, and it caused others to be utterly unable to dodge it or flee from it. Flee! Senior White let out a sharp cry. He was clearly aware that he'd underestimated the quintessence energy of a Daelord, and that was the reason why they'd fallen into such a disadvantageous situation. Damn it! At practically the exact same moment, Xianxia's face sank, and he turned around with the intention of dodged. He'd utterly never imagined that they would fall into such an extremely dangerous situation as soon as they took action, and it was even to the extent that he might lose the overarching heaven net. Swish! However, right at the instant when Xianxia intended to flash swiftly back to the first mountain, an expanse of blazing and rippling violet divine radiance suddenly swept out, and it collided head-on with the claw before it could descend onto Xianxia and Senior White. It was actually the 9th star Imperial Monarch, Dong Bowen, who'd launched the attack. Violet divine radiance seethed while carrying the supreme might of an Imperial Monarch and collided forcefully with the claw that blotted out the sky, causing a deafening explosion to resound and divine light to shoot into the surroundings. Such a collision could be said to be world-shaking, and it caused Xianxia to be practically unable to resist it at all, let alone move. Couldn't be helped. Regardless of whether it was the figure formed from the ancestral Dragon Daelord's quintessence energy or the 9th star Imperial Monarch Dong Bowen who made a move at this moment, both of them were too strong, and Xianxia, who was merely an intermediate-stage universe enlightened ancestral god, was bound to be unable to compare to them. Humph! The 30 kilometers tall figure seemed to have experienced pain, and it let out a cold and furious grunt that rumbled through the heavens and the earth like thunder. Dong Bowen seized this opportunity to grab Xianxia and bring Xianxia back to the peak of the first mountain. All right, it's safe now. Even though that fellow is formidable, it won't take the initiative to attack so long as one doesn't step foot into the area of the second restriction. Dong Bowen seemed to heave a sigh of relief in his heart. What are your intentions? Even though Xianxia was surprised and bewildered, his expression was still calm. He was unable to figure out why Dong Bowen had lent him a hand. Was it for the overarching heaven net? Or was it for the dragon origin pearl? Don't worry. If it was anyone else, then I would have seized those natural spirit treasures a long time ago, but I won't use force against you. Dong Bowen gazed at Xianxia as he spoke, and a wisp of a smile actually suffused his cold and indifferent face. He sighed with emotion and said, Actually, I should have guessed that only an existence like Oracle Mountain would be capable of fostering an extraordinary figure like you. Xianxia wasn't surprised that Dong Bowen had recognized his origins, and he was just unable to figure out Dong Bowen's attitude towards him. Suddenly, Dong Bowen asked, Are you the Grand Lord Wuxia's disciple? Xianxia shook his head. This caused Dong Bowen to be unable to help but be stunned. But what Xianxia said next caused Dong Bowen to suddenly open his eyes wide. Wuxia is my eldest senior brother. Xianxia's voice was extremely flat and calm. Eldest senior brother. Dong Bowen repeated these words once more, and then his expression suddenly became strange. He seemed to feeling surprise and disbelief, but in the end, all of it transformed into a complicated expression. I never expected that you're actually a personal disciple of Oracle Mountain's master. When he spoke up to hear, he took a deep breath and calmed his emotions. His handsome face carried a wisp of an amiable smile as he said, There's no need to be nervous. Since you're the Grand Lord's junior brother, then we're not outsiders. This caused Xianxia to be stunned, and he said with surprise, What do you mean by that? Dong Bowen said, All those years ago, I originally intended to join Oracle Mountain, yet I was unable to attain my wish, and I always felt that it was regrettable. However, even though I was unable to become a disciple of Oracle Mountain, I obtained a great deal of guidance from the Grand Lord, and it was all thanks to the Grand Lord's guidance that I was able to step into the Imperial Monarch realm and cultivate all the way to my current attainments. He paused for a moment and continued. So, even though the Grand Lord and I aren't master and disciple in name, we have the relationship of master and disciple. Since you're the Grand Lord's junior brother, then we're naturally not outsiders. When he heard all of this, Xianxia couldn't help but be slightly surprised. Never had he imagined that this 9th star Imperial Monarch standing before him would have actually received his eldest senior brother, Wuxia's, guidance all those years ago. So that's how it is. After a long time, Xianxia couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Even though the Grand Lord has always refused to take me as his disciple, he's already no different than my master in my heart. So, according to this sort of seniority, I should call you little martial uncle. Dong Bowen smiled lightheartedly. As a ninth-star Imperial Monarch, he'd actually spoken such words and actually didn't hesitate to assume the position of a junior. If the cultivators of the outside world found out about this, their jaws would definitely drop to the ground from shock. If this seniority was confirmed, then it would truly be astounding. Who would dare imagine a ninth-star Imperial Monarch addressing a young man at the intermediate stage of the universe enlightened ancestral god realm as little martial uncle? However, Xianxia didn't think in this way. He was very clearly aware that Dong Bowen had said this entirely because of his eldest senior brother, Wuxia, and it wasn't because Xianxia deserved to be given such face. I dare not accept that. Please just call me Xianxia. Xianxia cupped his hands as he spoke. All right. Dong Bowen smiled and nodded. All right. Can both of you stop talking nonsense? Since we're on the same side, then let's pass through this second restriction together, so as to avoid any changes in the situation arising from undue delay. Senior White, who'd remained silent until now, couldn't restrain himself from speaking. Xianxia couldn't help but glance at Dong Bowen when he heard this. Dong Bowen smiled and said, You're right. Since we're on the same side, then I'll naturally help you pass through this place. Perhaps I wouldn't dare boast like this in the past, but with the Dragon Origin Pearl and overarching Heaven Net, I have a certain level of confidence to be able to accomplish that. Senior White seemed to be slightly anxious, and he said vigilantly, Fellow Taoist, we didn't ask for your help. So, if we pass through the second restriction and find the fortune left behind by the ancestral Dragon Tao Lord, then you can't fight for it with us. Xianxia couldn't help but glare at Senior White when he heard this, yet the latter paid no attention to Xianxia and just stared fixedly at Dong Bowen. Dong Bowen went silent for a moment when he heard this, and then he said readily, All right, I guarantee that I won't do that. His voice was flat, yet it carried a resolute tone. He'd already waited here for 8,000 years, and he'd constantly exercised forbearance and hadn't left until now. All of it was done for the sake of obtaining that fortune and allowing himself to obtain a shred of a chance to advance into the Tao Lord realm. However, merely because Xianxia was Wuxia's junior brother, he'd resolutely given up this fortune, and Xianxia couldn't help but be slightly surprised by this. Since you're taking action with us, then you'll naturally have a share of this fortune. Xianxia took a deep breath and spoke slowly. Senior White was stunned. He glanced at Xianxia yet noticed that the latter had already made up his mind. So Senior White didn't say anything in the end. At this moment, Dong Bowen was slightly surprised by Xianxia's decision. Dong Bowen was just about to say something when Xianxia interrupted him and smiled. It's decided. If you don't agree, then we won't allow you to help us. Dong Bowen restrained his smile and glanced deeply at Xianxia before he suddenly said with a smile, As expected, even single disciple of Oracle Mountain is extraordinary. I agree. Then let's act quickly. It won't be long before that old fellow catches up. Senior White spoke in a slightly anxious tone. As he spoke, he glanced back towards the area covered by the first restriction. Imperial Monarch Tai Jing was on the verge of approaching them. Why don't I make a move and deal with that fellow first? Dong Bowen seemed to have thought of something, and he glanced at Imperial Monarch Tai Jing, who was approaching from afar. This suggestion instantly caused both Senior White and Xianxia to be extremely tempted. If this ninth-star Imperial Monarch, Dong Bowen, made a move and dealt with this huge trouble of theirs, which was Imperial Monarch Tai Jing, then it couldn't be any better. When he noticed this, Dong Bowen immediately understood tacitly, and he said with a smile, Leave it to me. However, to Xianxia and Senior White's surprise, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing seemed to have noticed something before Dong Bowen made a move, and his approaching figure suddenly turned around before he went back the way he came. He actually seemed as if he intended to withdraw and leave. Obviously, Imperial Monarch Tai Jing had recognized Dong Bowen, and when he saw Dong Bowen with Xianxia, he instantly realized that the situation was bad and decisive chose to retreat. That old bastard really acted quickly. Senior White sneered and ridiculed. Forget it. Don't pay any attention to him. Let's begin. Xianxia frowned. In the end, he decided to pay no further attention to Imperial Monarch Tai Jing for now. We can only do that. Dong Bowen sighed. He was confident in his ability to kill Imperial Monarch Tai Jing, but it was absolutely not under such circumstances. After all, his opponent was an imperial monarch and was within the area covered by dragon flame tribulation lightning. So, now that imperial monarch Taijing had chosen to retreat, he only had a slim chance of being able to annihilate imperial monarch Taijing. Imperial monarch Ziwei, Dong Bowen. How could it him? Didn't he go into closed-door cultivation 8,000 years ago? Why would he be here? What sort of relationship does he have with that kid? After hastily retreating from the first restriction, imperial monarch Taijing's expression turned livid and gloomy. He'd utterly never imagined that there would be so many twists and turns while merely pursuing a young man at the intermediate stage of the universe's enlightened ancestral god realm. Damn it! How truly damnable! Imperial monarch Taijing gnashed his teeth with hatred to the point they almost shattered, and his expression changed indeterminately. He felt that this operation had been too full of setbacks and unfortunate all along the way. This won't do. I can't let that kid go just like that. Even though Dong Bowen is formidable, I don't believe that they won't split up. After struggling inwardly for a long time, imperial monarch Taijing gritted his teeth in the end, and then he turned around and returned along the path he'd arrived here from. He intended to tell everything that occurred here to the clan before making a decision on what to do next. As far as imperial monarch Taijing was concerned, so long as she didn't leave Spectre Galaxy, then his Xiaohao clan still had a chance to annihilate Shi. The thing that truly troubled imperial monarch Taijing was Dong Bowen instead. If it wasn't for Dong Bowen, how could he have returned in such an embarrassing state? Bang! 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 Dong Bowen's figure was like a strand of seething violet divine radiance beneath the sky, and he fought the 30 kilometers figure that was formed by the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Tao Lord. For a time, this expanse of the heavens and the earth was in disorder. Space collapsed, all things were destroyed, and it was an extremely shocking scene. If one looked carefully, even though the 30 kilometers tall figure's combat strength was still extremely terrifying, its body was restrained by the overarching heaven net, causing it to be like a punching bag that was repeatedly blasted back by Dong Bowen. On the other hand, Shi, who stood in the distance, seized this opportunity to withdraw the dragon origin pearl and hurl it over forcefully. In an instant, the dragon origin pearl charged into the 30 kilometers tall figure and vanished in the blink of an eye. Compared to before, the situation had clearly become advantageous to them, with a 9th stat imperial monarch like Dong Bowen joining forces with them. She couldn't help but heave a long sigh of relief because of this. He'd already completed what he had to do, and now it all depended on how long that 30 kilometers tall figure could persist for. At this moment, she was able to clearly sense that the dragon origin pearl was ceaselessly absorbing the energy within that giant figure, and the 30 kilometers tall figure actually didn't notice it at all. If this continued, then even if Dong Bowen was unable to obliterate the figure, just relying on the dragon origin pearl alone would be sufficient to destroy it. This was a technique that Senior White had taught him. Even though the dragon origin pearl had been damaged earlier, it was a treasure that came from the same source as the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy. So, it was able to display inconceivable effects when dealing with the 30 kilometers tall figure. If it was able to absorb all the quintessence energy contained within the 30 kilometers tall figure, then the dragon origin pearl wouldn't just be repaired. Its might would become even stronger than before. Along with the passage of time, the aura of the 30 kilometers tall figure weakened gradually. Bang! After a short moment, Dong Bowen exerted strength with his palm and condensed a myriad of strands of divine radiance before he crushed the figure in one go, causing it to rumble as it shattered into numerous balls of light. The balls of light were extremely blazing, and they emanated the powerful quintessence energy of a Tao Lord. They were like a group of suns that were in disorder and were on the verge of dispersing in the heavens and the earth. In the years of the past, Dong Bowen had defeated his opponent on more than one occasion, and he was clearly aware that the 30 kilometers tall figure hadn't been crushed. Moreover, it wouldn't be long before the quintessence energy that had transformed into balls of light would fuse together once more and revive the 30 kilometers tall figure. He was unable to stop it because the quintessence energy was utterly impossible to destroy. It was precisely because of this that he'd been trapped here for 8,000 years and was unable to surmount this place until now. But it was very obvious that the situation this time wasn't the same as it was in the past because the overarching heaven net that could even capture the karmic luck of the heaven Tao was present here. Swish! At practically the exact same instant that the 30 kilometers tall figure crumbled into numerous balls of light, the overarching heaven net transformed into chilly starlight that completely restrained all the balls of light, causing them to be unable to escape. Quickly! This is the quintessence energy left behind by a Tao Lord, and it's the purest form of ancestral dragon energy in the world. If we're able to refine and absorb it, then it'll be extremely beneficial to our cultivation. Senior White's breathing became rapid, and he let out a shrill and loud cry. As he spoke, he flapped his wings and charged over, and then he grabbed a ball of light with his claws and shoved it in his mouth. She didn't hold back at all when he saw this, and he immediately flashed over and started to divide up the spoils. The energy within the balls of light was extremely powerful and pure. If it wasn't restrained by the overarching heaven net, then it wouldn't be long before they would condense once more into form and transform into the 30 kilometers tall dragon quintessence soul. But now, these balls of light were bound to be unable to fuse together. They were restrained by the overarching heaven net and confined separately. So, they were like numerous fruits that hung on the branches of a tree, and the only fate that awaited them was being seized one by one. These are yours. She controlled the overarching heaven net to divide a third of all the ball of light to Dong Bowen. Then I'll be helping myself. Dong Bowen smiled lightheartedly, and then he stretched out his hand and grabbed the balls of light over to himself. After that, he opened his mouth and swallowed them before he sat down cross-legged and started to meditate while refining and absorbing the balls of light. This was the quintessence energy left behind by a Tao Lord after death, and it was similarly extremely beneficial even to a 9th-star imperial monarch like him. She didn't delay when he saw this, and he summoned Yi Yen and Little Bao out before he started to divide up the remaining balls of light amongst the 4 of them. Little Bao said with surprise, "What's this?" Senior White refined and absorbed the balls of light with excitement while he said swiftly, "The quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Tao Lord." Little Bao was surprised. "My God! Is it true?" Senior White glared angrily at Little Bao. "What's with all the crap? Quickly make the best use of your time to refine and absorb them." "Oh!" Little Bao immediately shut his mouth and started to happily refine and absorb those balls of light. As for Yi Yen, she'd been constantly residing in the universe within Chen Shi's body since they entered Spectre Galaxy, so she wasn't aware of what had happened throughout this period of time. However, she didn't ask about it. When she heard Chen Shi's explanation, she immediately seized this opportunity and took a ball of light before starting to refine and absorb it. Even though the 30 kilometers tall figure was extremely tall and mighty, it merely left behind a little over 10 balls of light after it crumbled. After he gave some to Dong Bowen, Senior White, Little Bao, and Yi Yen, Shi merely had 2 left for himself. However, Shi was already very satisfied. It was Dong Bowen that contributed the most this time, so dividing a third to him was a matter of course. Shi didn't delay as well, and he swallowed the 2 balls of light and started to refine and absorb it with all his strength. Rumble! The energy within the balls of light was extremely powerful and vast. They were filled with extremely pure quintessence energy of a Tao Lord. So, as soon as they entered Shi's body, they transformed into a monstrous torrent that rumbled and surged. All those years ago in the Last Days domain, Shi had once obtained the energy left behind by the Rock Tao Lord while he was at the residence of the primeval micro-race. Now, when he started to refine and absorb the quintessence energy the ancestral dragon Tao Lord had left behind, he could be said to handle it with ease and skill, and he didn't encounter any problems. For a time, regardless of whether it was Shi, Senior White, or the others, all of them were immersed in their cultivation, and they utilized their full strengths to refine and absorb the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Tao Lord. So, the atmosphere here seemed very quiet. 6 hours later, Dong Bowen was the first to awaken from his meditation. He was a 9th-star imperial monarch, so even though he obtained a great deal of benefits from refining and absorbing the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Tao Lord, he couldn't be said to have obtained an obvious improvement. However, he was already very satisfied. An existence like him had already stepped foot into the peak ranks of the universe enlightened ancestral god realm since a long time ago, and taking another step in his path towards the Tao was simply even more difficult than ascending the heavens. So, it was utterly impossible to accomplish this by merely relying on the amount of time he cultivated. In other words, if Dong Bowen wanted to improve incessantly in his path of cultivation, then it didn't rely merely on his own hard work, and it relied on fortune, opportune moments, and chance. For example, obtaining the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Daolord just now was a form of fortune. Even though it was extremely tiny, it could still be considered as a form of strengthening in the end. I never expected that it would actually be all thanks to the assistance of the Grand Lord's junior brother that I would be able to break through this predicament and take another step forward. Dong Bowen couldn't help but sigh with emotion as he gazed at Chun, she who was meditating at the side. He'd been trapped here for 8,000 years and had been completely helpless and never been able to take another step forward. However, Chun Shi's appearance allowed a turn to appear in the situation he was in. So, how could he not sigh with emotion in his heart because of this? Another day passed. Senior White was actually the second to awaken from his cultivation, and he muttered in a slightly regretful tone. What a pity. It still wasn't enough energy? Dong Bowen couldn't help but be slightly surprised by this, and he was even more unable to see through this strange bird, because it was clearly only at the domain enlightened spirit god realm, yet its body was like a bottomless pit, and it actually didn't advance in its cultivation after refining and absorbing the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Daolord. Isn't this a little too strange? After all, if it was any other ordinary domain enlightened spirit god that refined and absorbed such energy, that domain enlightened spirit god would have broken through a long time ago. Exactly which clan are you from? Dong Bowen couldn't refrain from asking this question. I advise you not to ask about the origins of your ancestor. Senior White shot a sideways glance at Dong Bowen, and then spoke in an extremely proud manner. Dong Bowen couldn't help but chuckle. Yet he was clearly aware in his heart that the strange bird's origins were probably really as extraordinary as the strange bird had said. Bang! It wasn't long before a world-shocking bang resounded, and the little Bao awoke from his meditation. His eyes flowed with brilliant and resplendent golden radiance while his entire imposing aura had actually attained an obvious improvement when compared to the past. Little Bao had clearly obtained a great deal of benefit from the quintessence energy. Alas, it's really as Master said. A mere increase in energy is utterly unable to allow me to advance into the imperial monarch realm. Little Bao pulled a long face. He was a gold-eyed rhesus monkey, so his path of cultivation placed emphasis on the tempering of his mental state. If his mental state was unable to obtain a transformation, then it would be extremely difficult for him to advance in cultivation. Be content with what you have. Have you seen any cultivators at the perfection stage of the universe enlightened ancestral god realm capable of ceaselessly improving his strength like you can? Senior White chuckled and said, possessing such heaven-defying natural talents causes your path of advancement to be bound to be extremely difficult. Of course, you can't compare to me path of advancement. As he finished speaking, Senior White was both complacent and sighing, and he seemed extremely conflicted. Dong Bowen deeply agreed with Senior White's evaluation of Little Bao. The natural talent of a gold-eyed rhesus monkey was extremely heaven-defying indeed. They possessed shocking combat strength and were peerlessly ferocious. Their only flaw was possessed a wild and cruel, and extremely irritable mental state, and it greatly affected their paths of cultivation. But even then, Dong Bowen was very clearly aware that so long as this monkey continued on his path of cultivation, then his future would be limitless. How interesting! A strange bird of mysterious origin and a gold-eyed rhesus monkey that possesses heaven-defying natural talent. Where exactly did this Chun Shi find such help? Dong Bowen couldn't help but be lost in thought. After a few hours, Chun Shi awoke from his meditation as well, and his aura had clearly become much stronger than before. The facts were indeed so. After he refined and absorbed the ancestral dragon Daolord's quintessence energy, His cultivation had finally attained perfection in the intermediate stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm, and he'd started to approach the advanced stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm. Moreover, his foundation had been tempered and consolidated a step further, and it was extremely thick and solid. I never expected that I would be able to obtain such fortune before we even arrived at the ancestral dragon Daelord's tomb. It can really be considered as an unexpected gain. A wisp of a smile couldn't help but suffuse the corners of Xianxia's mouth when he sensed the changes in his aura. There are another 17 divine mountains in the second restriction, and it means that another 17 barriers lay before us on our path. However, so long as we cooperate well, then not only would we be able to pass through smoothly, we would even be able to obtain some quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Daelord just like we did earlier. Senior white-yellow in a slightly excited tone, and he seemed to be eager and prepared to go all out. Awesome! Little Bao was extremely happy as well. Dong Bowen couldn't help but smile, and he seemed to have been affected by them, casing him to be suddenly filled with anticipation towards the 17 divine mountains that they had to traverse next. Let's talk about it after Yi Yen wakes up. She seemed to be very calm, and he gazed at Yi Yen who was seated cross-legged as she cultivated at the side. Pooh! Right at this moment, Yi Yan's peerlessly gorgeous face turned pale, and then a mouthful of blood sprayed out from her mouth. This caused Xianxia to be instantly shocked. What happened? Ha! Dong Bowen seemed to have realized something, and he suddenly shouted, causing his voice to resound by Yi Yan's ears. Yi Yan's entire body trembled, and then she seemed as if she'd awakened from a dream. However, at this moment, she seemed to carry a lingering fear in her heart, and she seemed to have experienced something extremely terrifying just now. It isn't good to charge through to the next realm of cultivation by force. The Imperial Monarch realm isn't as simple as you think. If the right moment hasn't come, then forcefully charging into it will only cause you to encounter chi deviation. It's extremely dangerous. Dong Bowen exposed what Yi Yen had done just now, and it immediately allowed Xianxia to understand that Yi Yen had actually tried to rely on this opportunity to charge into the Imperial Monarch realm. Yi Yen nodded, and then she said bitterly, "Thank you for saving me, Senior. I was too impatient indeed. It's fine so long as you're all right. You'll have an ample amount of opportunities in the future." Xianxia consoled from the side. "All right, since she's fine, then let's quickly make a move." Senior White spoke impatiently. They didn't hesitate and strode through space under Dong Bowen's lead to arrive before the second divine mountain. Bang! When their arrival was detected, a 30 kilometers tall figure floated up into appearance in the heavens and the earth. Its imposing aura was powerful like a dragon and shot into the sky. It was extremely similar to the dragon quintessence soul that was formed from the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy. However, its aura was even stronger. Xianxia's group was already prepared for this. It was still Dong Bowen who collided head-on with the 30 kilometers tall figure, whereas Xianxia utilized the overarching Heaven Net and Dragon Origin Pearl to launch a surprise attack against it. 2 hours later, the battle ended, and Xianxia's group had once more obtained the balls of light that were formed from the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Daelord. After they divided it amongst each other, they started to refine and absorb it. 1 month later, Xianxia's group had traversed the 9th divine mountain in the area covered by the second restriction. During this entire process, Dong Bowen, who was a 9th-star Imperial Monarch, had taken the front line, and he played a very important role. Of course, if it wasn't for the overarching Heaven Net and Dragon Origin Pearl in Xianxia's possession, then Dong Bowen would definitely be unable to defeat numerous formidable and terrifying opponents with such ease. At the same time, all of them obtained quite a sizable amount of the ancestral dragon Daelord's quintessence energy with every single opponent they defeated. Moreover, refining and absorbing these balls of light that were formed from quintessence energy allowed their cultivations to improve ceaselessly during this short period of a month. Even though the extent of their improvement was very small, it was absolutely more effective than bitterly cultivating behind closed doors for a few thousands of years. Could be said to be marvelously quick. For example, when Xianxia arrived at the 9th divine mountain, His cultivation was merely a trace away from stepping into the advanced stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm. All of these changes had occurred in a mere month of time. If the other cultivators in the outside world found out about such a speed of cultivation, they would probably be unable to believe it. The only thing that surprised Xianxia was that no matter if it was Senior White or Little Bao, even though they'd obtained a huge amount of benefit from the balls of light, they actually showed no signs of advancing. This clearly showed how abnormal their natural talent was, and it couldn't be judged by logic at all. As for Yi Yan, because she'd already attained the perfection stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm, if she wasn't able to capture the critical factor to advance into the imperial monarch realm, then it would be useless no matter how many balls of light she obtained. So, she'd given up all intentions of refining and absorbing the balls of light, and she put them away with the intention of utilizing them when she charged into the imperial monarch realm in the future. Dong Bowen had similarly obtained a huge amount of benefits. However, his cultivation had already arrived at the peak of the 9th-star imperial monarch realm since a long time ago, so his improvements seemed to be extremely tiny when compared to Xianxia and the others. However, even then, it was sufficient to make him feel satisfied. He was clearly aware that if it was in the past, then it would be utterly impossible to accomplish such improvement without spending a few tens of thousands of years in cultivating. Xianxia's group became vigilant because the opponent they encountered from the 9th Divine Mountain onward grew more and more stronger, and even Dong Bowen was barely able to withstand the opponent they faced and was constantly in danger. Fortunately, the Dragon Origin Pearl had started to display a critical effect. It ceaselessly absorbed the quintessence energy contained within their opponent, allowing Dong Bowen to merely have to persist without losing before they could exhaust their opponent to death. 3 months later, Xianxia's group experienced all sorts of dangers and finally arrived on the 18th Divine Mountain within the area covered by the second restriction. Only the last opponent remains. Dong Bowen spoke with a slightly hoarse voice, and he was gasping for breath. Moreover, a wisp of exhaustion that was impossible to disguise suffused his brows. During these 3 months of time, he'd ceaselessly fought those 30 kilometers tall figures. In the beginning, he was still able to persist, but he soon fell into a state of being completely suffered, and being ceaselessly suppressed caused him to suffer repeated injury. The reason he was able to defeat his opponent in the end was entirely because of the Dragon Origin Pearl. This treasure was able to ceaselessly absorb the quintessence energy within the 30 kilometers tall figures, and it wouldn't be noticed by the 30 kilometers tall figures. It was precisely by relying on this sort of exhaustion that they were able to make their opponent's strength weaken incessantly before being defeated at Dong Bowen's hands in the end. You can't continue toughing it out anymore. You must recover properly this time. Senior White had a solemn expression. Even though Senior White hadn't helped much all along the way, he'd witnessed the entire process of the battles, and he was clearly aware that Dong Bowen was in a slightly bad state. Even though he was a 9th-star imperial monarch, he'd suffered a great deal of injuries all along the way, and he might even suffer a mishap if he continued persisting. Exactly. We're only a step away from passing through the second restriction, so there's no rush to move forward. Xianxia nodded. The consumption of his strength during these past 3 months was extremely huge. Not only did he have to control the overarching heaven net, he had to utilize the Dragon Origin Pearl at the same time. Even though he hadn't encountered any danger, he'd endured an extremely large amount of mental pressure. All right. Dong Bowen took a deep breath, and then he sat down cross-legged and started to meditate. Little Bao, Yi Yan, and Senior White, all of you stay on guard. Xianxia instructed before he started to meditate as well. During these 3 months of time, his cultivation had already stepped into the advanced stage of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm. Presently, he was approaching the peak of the universe-enlightened ancestral god realm, and all of this was closely related to the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Downlord that they were constantly refining and absorbing. If we consider it carefully, we would really be unable to arrive here without the assistance of this brother. Senior White couldn't help but sigh slightly with emotion when he saw Xianxia and Dong Bowen had entered into meditative states. Yi Yan and Little Bao deeply agreed. If Dong Bowen hadn't kept their opponents busy by engaging with the 30 kilometers tall figures in direct battles, then even if their group possessed the overarching Heaven Net and Dragon Origin Pearl, it would definitely be impossible to come this far. After all, the dangers that filled the second restriction was too terrifying. The 30 kilometers tall figures that were formed from the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Downlord grew stronger the further they went. Moreover, even a ninth-star imperial monarch like Dong Bowen was completely suppressed by them, and it clearly showed how dangerous the second restriction was. It was no wonder that all the cultivators who came to Spectre Galaxy throughout the boundless years of the past with the intention of searching for the fortuitous encounter hidden within Spectre Galaxy had returned in failure. Moreover, no one had ever succeeded to this date. It was because merely this second restriction was sufficient to make most cultivators fear to even take a step into it. However, if we didn't have the assistance of the overarching Heaven Net and Dragon Origin Pearl that Xianxia possessed, then it would definitely be impossible to arrive here by relying solely on this brother's ability. Senior White changed the topic and he said, "This is like the saying, cooperation brings benefit to both. So, we don't owe each other anything, and we don't have to be grateful to him." Yen and Little Bao smiled and said, "Of course." 10 days later, Xianxia woke up from his meditation. On the 5th day after Xianxia woke up, Dong Bowen recovered completely. "Let's begin." Dong Bowen's gaze was like a bolt of lightning, and it emanated an oppressive, imposing aura. "So long as we pass through this final barrier, then we'll be able to lay eyes upon the true tomb of the ancestral dragon Downlord." Just these words alone caused the spirits of Xianxia and the others to be refreshed, and they were filled with anticipation. Senior White couldn't help but feel slightly worried when he heard this. Dong Bowen's strength was too formidable. So, if they really found the fortune left behind by the ancestral dragon Downlord, then if Dong Bowen aroused covetous intentions and wanted to seize all of it, then the consequences would be unimaginable. Don't worry. If he dares to arouse covetous intent, then I'll make him fail even if I have to destroy all the natural spirit treasures in my possessed. Xianxia had noticed Senior White's worries, and he said swiftly via voice transmission, "Not to mention that this Dong Bowen doesn't seem like a person with malicious intentions, so such a situation should probably not occur." "I hope so." Senior White sighed. He was unable to avoid feeling worried, because since the ancient times, wealth moved the hearts of men, let alone a supreme fortune left behind by the ancestral dragon Downlord. Anything could happen when one was facing such an extremely enormous temptation. Unexpectedly, the final opponent for the 18th Divine Mountain in the second restriction was actually extraordinarily formidable. Even if Dong Bowen utilized all his ability, he was actually unable to withstand it at all, and he was defeated and heavily injured as soon as the battle began. It was even to the extent that if Xianxia and the others hadn't dodged in time, they would have almost suffered calamity and perished on the spot. The only thing they felt fortunate about was that the Dragon Origin Pearl had already entered their opponent's body, and it was ceaselessly absorbing the energy within it. After Xianxia's group returned to the peak of the mountain, the Dragon Origin Pearl was like a parasite that constantly absorbed and swallowed the figure's energy. This allowed Xianxia and the others to instantly heavy sighs of relief in their hearts. This was good as well because there was no need for Dong Bowen to fight the figure any longer, and they just had to wait patiently to completely exhaust the 30 kilometers tall figure. However, in this way, they would be unable to obtain the quintessence energy left behind by the 30 kilometers tall figure. But Xianxia and the others couldn't be bothered about all of that. So long as they were able to kill their opponent and leave the second restriction smoothly, then it would be sufficient. Hee, this isn't bad at all. Dong Bowen is already heavily injured. So, if you fight desperately with your life on the line, you can utilize the Godslaughter Burst and detonate natural spirit treasures to fight him. Moreover, Little Bao's strength has been increasing explosively without end during this period of time, and he'll be of use as well. During the process of waiting, Senior White couldn't help but send Xianxia a voice transmission. Under such circumstances, I hope that fellow doesn't arouse covetous intentions. Otherwise, it's impossible to determine who the final victor will be. Xianxia's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. 2 days later, rumble. The 30 kilometers tall dragon quintessence soul formed from the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Downlord rumbled as it transformed into dust and dirt that vanished in the heavens and the earth. Only an extremely brilliant and blazing pearl revolved and floated in midair. Compared to before, the dragon origin pearl seemed to be extraordinarily dazzling now. It hadn't just been completely repaired. Its might even more than 2 times stronger. All of this had come from the quintessence energy of the ancestral dragon Dowlord that it had absorbed. When she kept the dragon origin pearl away, the scene in the distance suddenly started to change, and the heavens, the earth, and the stars moved. The force field that covered the second restriction vanished silently, while the 18 divine mountains gradually blurred before vanishing like an illusion. In merely the time of a few breaths, the scene before their eyes flashed, and when their fields of vision recovered, they noticed that they were actually standing on a boundlessly vast and quiet expanse of the starry sky. After that, they noticed an astounding scene. A bronze coffin floated in the depths of the starry sky. A dense expanse of brilliant stars circled around it, and it floated silently while emanating an extremely ancient and mysterious aura that covered the entire starry sky.